I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker. So the movie rests in the visuals, and it's very hard to predict exactly how that's going to play until you've actually cut it together. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly. I take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's a style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. Visuals and music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing. This whole series of films is based on a 30s genre, on a serial. The acting style is very much from the 30s. Conceptually, it's using the influence and the inspiration of the 30s films as its basis, and the most central of which, obviously, is the Saturday matinee serial.
Welcome back, everyone, to the legacy of George Lucas. What was originally meant to be one mega-long video that thoroughly discusses and negates all of the lies and misconceptions surrounding one of cinema and humanity's greatest artists, is now, at least for the meantime, an ongoing series of videos, and what you're currently watching is part 2 of that series. It's highly recommended that you go back and watch part 1 of the series first, since in that video I do lay out much of the groundwork for the rest of what's to come in this series. That said, you should still get plenty out of this video in isolation, as well as parts 3 and 4 as well. But much like Star Wars itself, no matter which order you watch these videos in, if you go back to what was chronologically meant as the first chapter and experience the series from start to finish, as it was meant to be, you'll be getting the most out of this. And frankly, given what I have to say on this subject matter, I think you owe that much to yourselves.
You gotta remember, this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
And if you have any respect for Star Wars whatsoever before it was sold and ruined by Disney, I think you owe that much to George Lucas as well, since what I'm about to discuss played at least some part in making that happen.
Repent, and thou shalt be saved.
Part 1 of this series was titled The Style of Star Wars, which basically discussed all of the tiresome misconceptions about George Lucas as a filmmaker, his supposed lack of ability as a director, as a writer, and as an artist. The metric crap tons of those idiotic claims range as wide as an ocean, aided by the copy-paste keyboard function with the depth of a puddle, and the accuracy of a toddler aiming for the toilet.
I missed.
Oh, hell no.
Part 2, however, is going to discuss extensively the disingenuous agenda of the media, including a certain pathetic, petulant collective of Star Wars fans who would later become members of the media, or shitty online media outlets, not that there's much of a difference, as well as media influencers and or critics who have cultivated decades of falsehoods surrounding the creation of the original Star Wars trilogy in order to discredit the man who created it by any shameless means necessary, including but not limited to taking excerpts from various books and interviews from Lucas himself, as well as the cast and crew, out of context to further their agenda, or just blatantly making shit up and lying to satiate their bloodlust for the guy who supposedly, quote-unquote, ruined their childhood.
George Lucas raped our childhood, George Lucas.
With his later edits, his author-approved canonical edits of the films they cherish so dearly, as well as the mere existence of the prequel trilogy. And what's truly disgusting is how the ones perpetrating this are doing so utterly shamelessly and actively preying on the confirmation bias of the same shallow imbeciles who share their perspective, or the sheer ignorance of the average casual moviegoer so insecure about having any kind of opinion of their own, they end up using the internet in search of validation rather than insight.
The fact is, people will buy any cheap lie if it'll justify their unending laziness.
Now, granted, this agenda did start off innocently enough with a simple, slight division in the fanbase after the release of The Empire Strikes Back, which, as revisionist history, orchestrated by this same collective, would like to have you believe, was always perceived as being the quote-unquote greatest Star Wars movie ever made.
No!
This, however, wasn't actually the case at the time. Empire Strikes Back was still beloved by the vast majority of audience goers, but a sizable portion of the fanbase was disappointed, and while the majority did in fact love the movie, it was in fact seen as a less than to the original Star Wars that George Lucas wrote and directed, because A, it was the middle chapter of the original trilogy with several open plot threads still hanging about by the end, and B, it wasn't seen as being as much fun to experience as the first film.
Do you think this is going to be as big as Star Wars?
Bigger! Yeah.
Bigger. And yet a lot of the critics are panning it.
Well, what do they know?
It's funny, people always say that now. They comment about, Empire being a favorite. Yet at the time, it was not considered that. You have to think back, how so capricious the world of entertainment is in terms of the audience response. The first film came out, New Hope, and it was extremely well received, surprised everyone. It had all the success of something brand new for the first time. Then you do a sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, and people's expectations now are very high. They remember how they reacted to the first film. And Empire is paced differently, and it's a darker story. And it doesn't have a complete resolution at the end. It leaves things undone. And when it came out, there was a lot of reaction of disappointment. There wasn't this judgment that it was the best of the three films or anything of that sort. It was a success, of course, and it was, respected. But people spoke less of it. There was kind of, well, it's okay, I guess. And, it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. It was sort of the attitude. Given time, you look back at this middle act, which is The Empire Strikes Back, and it takes on it's in a different context. You see the good performances. You're not bothered by the lack of resolution in the story completely. It's satisfying. And you know that it's part of a greater story. And you're not just measuring against the impact the first film had. I think when they're all done and, 10 years go by, maybe sort of put them all together and look at it, maybe it'll take on some new meaning that we don't know about yet. I think it will.
Now, fast forward to when Return of the Jedi came out, and Empire Strikes Back was seen in a much brighter light, because many of the plot threads were resolved and people had taken the time to absorb the film and the nuances. But now, with Return of the Jedi, this cycle, so to speak, would repeat itself. And once again, just like Empire and just like the original Star Wars, it was beloved by the majority of audience members, many of which still see it as their favorite Star Wars film to this very day.
This has left me practically utterly speechless, actually, but it was the best one ever.
The first showing of Return of the Jedi at Highland Mall was at 11 this morning, but the line you see winding around three sides of the theater started forming at 10.
I'm a new woman. It's the truth. Good prevails. We will all conquer. It's very good.
No, it was definitely the greatest science fiction movie ever made. I was right in there. Lucas, total genius all the way. the sound, the visual. It was a total experience.
But a sizable portion of disgruntled fans now thought of Return of the Jedi as the lesser than to Empire Strikes Back, which was much more mature, whereas Return of the Jedi was seen as too childish and poorly paced compared to the previous two films, and so Return of the Jedi, by this vocal collective, became the black sheep of the franchise for quite some time.
I'm just saying, Empire is still the best. It's the most complex, the most sophisticated. Wasn't afraid to have a dark ending.
Yeah, but come on, if it wasn't for the first one, you wouldn't have any of the rest of the movies.
Well, at least we can all agree the third one's always the worst.
These people then began formulating notions that Lucas was losing his touch, so to speak, and simply wanted to cash his chips and retire after the end of Return of the Jedi. Not accounting for the fact that he was just completely burnt out after going through the Herculean task of overseeing the trilogy, as well as a messy divorce and the fact that he had just become a parent and simply wanted to take a step back, enjoy life, and raise his daughter. Now, these wild notions about Lucas incubated for quite some time, and it was still relatively innocent during this period, just simple misunderstandings and ignorance at this point, but it hadn't really started to take on the form of this malicious snowball effect until the arrival of what was then known as the Star Wars Special Editions, which are now simply the objectively canonical Star Wars films, where several changes and or additions were made to the films, which were done to tell a more cohesive story, as many directors, authors, and or storytellers have done in the past, and still do to this very day. Many of whom that actually did own the IP, as George Lucas did with Star Wars, insisted on those later editions as being the official versions because, well, why wouldn't they? It's the revised, definitive version of their art. Now, this same collective I spoke about is also guilty of more revisionist history in saying that the special editions were always despised upon release and that everyone saw it as a complete travesty and that George Lucas committed crimes against cinema, blah, 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 but that wasn't the case.
But like I already said, in spite of the subsequent escalating backlash, the special editions were mostly positively received at the time when they came out.
The re-release of Star Wars has already earned nearly $70 million in just 3 weeks.
As of today, it is the #1 box office attraction of all time in the U.S. and Canada. Sometime last night, Star Wars became the first movie to blow past the $400 million mark.
It's more than a movie. It is an event.
Now there's an even better one, a new and improved Star Wars.
Boasting refurbished footage, sassed up special effects, and even a new scene or two, the Star Wars re-release, to be followed in turn by the other movies in Lucas's trilogy, 1980's The Empire Strikes Back and 1983's Return of the Jedi, more than lives up to its special edition tag.
This Star Wars special edition boasts new special effects and added scenes to the delight of fans who came out in full force to cheer the premiere.
Mark's amazed by the success of the special edition.
That premiere surprised me. I mean, the wave of positive feeling coming from the grandstands after all these years.
George Lucas is my hero, I'll tell you.
Star Wars Special Edition continues to amaze Hollywood with its stellar success. In some cities, the opening night for The Empire Strikes Back has already sold out.
So, George, when you were kind of sitting at home and you saw the kind of news response to the opening of Star Wars several weeks ago, did you think Shazam? What did you think?
I don't know. I mean, it's very strange. It's like being in the Twilight Zone. It's like, it's not just the reissue, it's like a revisiting of the entire event.
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't expect this to happen.
The only people who really hated the special editions was, again, this small but vocal collective of fans projecting their hatred onto everyone else and gaslighting them into sharing and propagating their perspective. And this is where the agenda against George Lucas really started to become petty and malicious, and this resulted in this collective of disgruntled Star Wars fans propagating nonsense like George Lucas altering the movies to deny his wife participation credits, as well as numerous other ridiculous assertions or just outright lying about why they simply didn't like or approve of the changes, as if it was ever up to them to begin with. Including but not limited to white knighting for other contributing artists they pretended to give even the slightest shit about, like the two hired hands George Lucas appointed to helm principal photography on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, those being Irvin Kershner and Richard Marquand. These fans feigned outrage on their behalf for the changes being made in the special editions, claiming that it was desecrating their movies, which was simply untrue on both counts, since these are and always have been George Lucas's movies that they merely participated in. Ultimately, this led to even more wild notions that George Lucas was some kind of false idol and a fraud who supposedly didn't know what he was doing and what made Star Wars so great to begin with. So after what was perceived by this collective as Lucas's latest insult, to them anyway, the powder keg of petulance was loaded and was just waiting for the right spark to ignite it, which was then set ablaze with the arrival of the Star Wars prequels when they were finally released, starting with The Phantom Menace. This powder keg exploded, and this malicious snowball effect surrounding George Lucas eventually turned into an avalanche. Basically, the same collective of clowns who were pissy at George Lucas for making Star Wars less gritty and mature than Empire Strikes Back with Return of the Jedi, and didn't like that he made the special editions, also didn't like the fact that they weren't given a rerun of their childhood with the prequels, and that George Lucas kept making Star Wars solely for children for the sake of profit, pretending, of course, that it wasn't always a modern fairy tale primarily meant for the child demographic. Oh, we will come back to that. Because these individuals had simply grown up, well, physically anyway. What this led to was an onslaught of ridiculous notions that due to the child-friendly tone of the prequels, more prominent CGI characters, the old-fashioned romance subplot, the supposed excess of action over story and emotion, and the quote-unquote unnatural dialogue of the space fantasy setting in the Star Wars prequels, as well as the acting, that George Lucas was supposedly never a good writer or director, and because this collective of petulant shitfucks couldn't divorce their love from the films that their childhoods held so dear, they could, however, divorce their love from George Lucas and make him the enemy that needed to be stopped from ruining their precious franchise at all costs. That's why the climate surrounding Star Wars went from the original film in Empire Strikes Back versus Return of the Jedi, and it suddenly became the original trilogy versus the prequel trilogy, with Return of the Jedi suddenly being lumped in with the two films that it was widely considered lesser than. And this is when Empire Strikes Back, through revisionism, suddenly became considered the greatest Star Wars film, not due to the quote, "I am your father" twist, which had always been there, but because it suddenly became the film that George Lucas supposedly had the least or hardly any involvement in, and Irvin Kershner basically froze out George Lucas's creative input altogether, which according to them made that film a masterpiece, unlike Return of the Jedi, which, according to these people, George Lucas ruined or made lesser by being too involved with and crushing the creative prowess of director Richard Marquand. And while much of this collective wouldn't put Return of the Jedi above the original Star Wars, the only way that they could circumvent the obvious flaw with their narrative against Lucas, because he was the one who wrote and directed the original Star Wars film, which was the most widely praised and most successful. And the way these clowns like to have their cake and eat it too is by attributing all of that success and all of the genius in that movie to other people who weren't collaborators on the prequels.
That's a good one.
Most particularly George Lucas's ex-wife Marsha Lucas and the other two editors, who this collective of individuals scarcely mention, because they decided to start telling this stomach-churning lie that Star Wars was apparently saved in the edit by George Lucas's ex-wife. That these people had to save the precious childhood trilogy that they grew up with from being ruined by the evil George Lucas. That every decision George Lucas made was done with no creative prowess whatsoever, or simply for the sake of making money and not art. And because of the absence of these individuals, along with screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan and producer Gary Kurtz, who were apparently there to keep him in check.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
This apparently then saw George Lucas and his terrible decisions enabled by spineless quote-unquote yes men that he cherry-picked for the production of the Star Wars prequels, whereas on the original trilogy, these specific individuals were around to protect Star Wars from him, and despite them not having the power to do this, were able to tell him no and keep his creative ideas in check, which is supposedly the reason for the night and day difference in quality between the original trilogy and the Star Wars prequels. And this has been sickeningly regurgitated to the point where it's like these people just have a copy-pasted script ready to go that they always resort to in order to list their complaints and supposed evidence of the Star Wars prequels apparently being bad films and or not the Star Wars they grew up with. Now, of course, despite what this collective would have you believe, this did not happen overnight.
10 loved it, 7 liked it or thought it was okay, and 2 are no longer Star Wars fans.
It was good, dude. It was really good.
So worth it. So worth it.
They're gonna love it. They're gonna go nuts. It was amazing.
I couldn't get enough of it. I want to see it again already.
It was amazing. It was everything I thought it was going to be and more.
I think that little Anakin Skywalker, and everyone's going to say it, stole that movie.
Thumbs up or thumbs down?
God, I'd put my feet up if I could.
It's fantastic. Good special effects, good story. Lives up to the originals.
It'll be a great movie 20 years from now. It'll be part of 6 great movies. Unless the next 2 really suck, but I don't think they will.
From Moscow to Miami, the doors finally opened, and after weeks of waiting in line, the Star Wars faithful finally got to see Episode 2.
Been in line for 350 some odd hours. 378 hours.
The legions of fans poured in to see Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, last night.
Michael, we're only 3 hours away from the premiere of Revenge of the Sith, and this place, well, it's already packed. Tickets to the first show, they sold out weeks ago, and hardcore fans, well, they began lining up as early as last night to get those best seats of the house. And we got some early reviews from theater employees who saw the movie last night, and they say Revenge of the Sith lives up to the hype.
He's been in line for more than 30 hours.
The crowds, the people, the fun, sword fights, Xbox, Halo, just ridiculous.
It's been great. It's been really fun. I didn't think camping out for a movie with a bunch of geeks would be that much fun, but I fit right in.
Absolutely great. It's probably one of the best ones.
Amazed Yoda is.
Devoted fans, maybe a bit too devoted, of Star Wars flocked to theaters all across the country, including the Palace at Elmwood, early this morning for the latest installment, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. People waited in long lines for hours, and most of the fans we talked to say it lived up to all the hype.
The prequels, like Return of the Jedi, like The Empire Strikes Back, were beloved upon release, and simply had their share of detractors, largely from this same collective of disgruntled fans who had incubated into a much larger group over time, long before the prequels were even released.
The overwhelming verdict was a thumbs up. This film is going to take this country by storm. I mean, regardless of what the critics are saying, some are saying the acting's wooden, there's too many special effects, but really most of them are saying, hey, Star Wars is just about escapism, it's about having a good bit of fun. Although the critics haven't all been kind, the audiences don't seem to care.
It was the best. It was very, very good.
Yeah, thumbs up. I really, really enjoyed it. It reminded me of just being a little boy all over again. Really excellent. I loved it.
Do you think this is going to be as big as Star Wars?
Bigger! Yeah.
Bigger. And yet a lot of the critics are panning it.
Well, what do they know?
How worried are you that the critics are not going to like this new movie?
Oh, I'm not worried at all. They haven't liked any of them, really. And they especially haven't liked the last 2. So,
well, exactly.
Hey, it can't get any worse.
And the outrage was much more pronounced and magnified due to the advent and accessibility of the internet, which was also signal boosted by the mainstream media, and in fact it took several years, as well as the arrival of social media, for this climate around Star Wars to devolve into this absolute petulant cesspool online of lies and bullshit levied against George Lucas, as well as the Star Wars trilogy that these individuals didn't like, which started with older generation fans that bled into, again, the mainstream media, film critics, and eventually social media influencers, as well as their newer generation copycats who propagated the same lies and bullshit for the sake of A, satisfying their own petty agenda, B, shamelessly to make money, or C, both. The long and short of it is that This collective of butthurt, petulant, older generation Star Wars simpletons fabricated incorrect assertions, misconceptions, dishonest or unreliable accounts, and outright lies that basically equated to a smear campaign, really, that was designed to ruin the reputation of one of cinema's greatest and most important artists. Not only did these human embarrassments go as far as to make a shitty documentary film openly propagating this cavalcade of lies and bullshit surrounding George Lucas, exhibiting zero self-awareness and acting like this pathetic fucking agenda of theirs was actually something to be proud of, but many of these individuals who were young at the time when these narratives surrounding George Lucas began to formulate would eventually become members of the mainstream media, people in the film industry, or hell, even social media influencers who would all shamelessly propagate the same tired, regurgitated false information either through their own ignorance, or even more damningly, their willful ignorance or outright malicious intent to burn George Lucas to the ground and satisfy their own fanboy hate boner for the man, but also for the sake of their own shameless greed for willfully propagating what the perceived popular opinion or trend is online, despite how incorrect it is in order to make money. And you will be just amazed at how far this goes.
This is your last chance. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
So what do you say we get started with what is arguably the largest source of misinformation that both the media and certain fans and influencers like to exploit as much as possible as a means of discrediting George Lucas as the true genius behind the creation and success of the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as his capabilities as a writer and director, which is the extremely questionable and or deliberately misrepresented accounts of the original Star Wars cast working with George Lucas. And while it's true the cast did find Star Wars both as a concept and as a script to be a very acquired taste to get comfortable with, at least initially, however, the lie that's propagated for why the actors were initially so worried about the script is that they thought it was awful writing because George was simply a bad writer, when in actuality the reason for this was that the dialogue itself was just completely bizarre, that they couldn't understand what George Lucas was going for. As actors, it's their job to communicate the dialogue to the audience in a manner that feels spontaneous. Star Wars dialogue is otherworldly dialogue that takes inspiration from the 30s and 40s adventure serials that most, if not all of the cast were completely unfamiliar with. And so the dialogue felt incredibly strange to them.
Who talks like this?
George? The most famous examples of incredibly disingenuous Star Wars fans, and especially the media lying about what the actors really thought about working with George Lucas, is this quote from Harrison Ford.
It's interesting because the dialogue throughout the series has resonated so much with so many people. I mean, obviously people tattooed it, lived by it, etc. But for you, infamously, and the actors, some of it was tough for you to probably get through and reasonably make sound authentic and real.
It's part of the job of the actor to torture the director.
Oh, that's what that was about?
Well, the director, in this case, George, was also the writer.
Right.
So he was responsible. And I did say, George, you can type this shit, but you cannot say it.
Now, the part that George Lucas detractors, including but not limited to every shitty-ass paid-for media outlet of cuckolds, love to leave out of this story is the fact that Harrison Ford, in the original interview where he first said this, publicly conceded that he was wrong and that the dialogue for Star Wars worked.
I know, right?
What's that? You didn't know that Harrison Ford, in the same quote, actually walked back his remarks about George's dialogue? Yeah, I thought not. It's not a story that Gen X would tell you, because it's based in facts, not fiction. Unlike 99% of the words that come out of their fucking mouths about George Lucas as a filmmaker, including but not limited to his bean-headed wife saving his movie in the same editing room where he was telling her what to do.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
The Death Star was not about to destroy the Rebel base. It was literally just sitting there, waiting to be blown up. This is where Marshall Lucas came in. The first thing she did was recut the trench run, basically from the ground up. This included removing Luke's first run, but also more importantly, incorporating the idea that the Death Star was about to blow up the Rebel base.
Liar!
The fourth moon of Yavin.
Fourth moon of Yavin.
I've given the coordinates to Chewbacca.
Don't you understand? They let us go. They're going to follow us. They want to find your hidden bases. They're going to destroy the entire system.
I know they'll follow. And they'll bring the Death Star. But our only hope is to destroy it before it destroys us.
Just as another example, these individuals also love to actively misquote Lucas about advocating for not changing the works of art despite making the special editions, when in actuality Lucas was advocating for protecting an artist's right to change their own work.
People who like to trash Lucas over the special editions are really fond of using this quote here. Lucas said at one point, "People who alter or destroy works of art and our cultural heritage for profit or as an exercise of power are barbarians, and if the laws of the United States continues to condone this behavior, history will surely classify us as a barbaric society." When people quote this to use it against Lucas, they think this makes him sound like a hypocrite, but what it actually shows is that they don't know anything about the rest of the quote or when or why he said it. Lucas said this when he was testifying to Congress about corporations colorizing movies in their back catalog after the original filmmakers have died and can no longer give consent. The people quoting this don't use the rest of the quote, where Lucas continued by saying, "American law does not protect our painters, sculptors, recording artists, authors, or filmmakers from having their life work destroyed and their reputation ruined. If something is not done now to clearly state the moral rights of artists, current and future technologies will alter, mutilate, and destroy for future generations the subtle human truths and highest human feeling that talented individuals within our society have created." The point here that Lucas was making with this speech was that artists should always have the final say over the preservation of their own work, not audiences or the corporations that own the work. Even more specifically, Lucas said to Wired magazine in 1989, "Everybody signs on to bring forth the director's vision. That's part of the way movies are made and always have been. The real issue is whether a corporation that buys the film 10 years later on has the right to change it. My response continues to be no." Since in this case Lucas is talking about the right of artists to decide how their work is presented, trying to use these quotes to say that he has an obligation to present a version of his work that he considers inferior is of course completely idiotic. And yet fanboys take half a quote out of context constantly to try to do exactly that, to use it to mean the exact opposite of what Lucas was trying to say with this.
And you have a thing about artist rights. I know you're trying to work with Congress on that.
What artist rights we're fighting for is the ability of corporations and executives in those corporations to alter movies for their own whim, to just change them, to take a black and white movie, make it color, make a widescreen movie small, to re-edit it, to take out a certain political concern or whatever, or to add a different music score, to add a pop score instead of a classical score, and those sort of things, in order to make it more commercial, in order to maybe find another market for it. Those things should be left to the filmmaker. The filmmaker should decide what happens to their work, not a nameless, faceless corporation. And right now, the way the law reads, any corporation can change any movie any way they want, and it would be lost forever to the rest of the society. And this is part of our heritage.
And numerous other narratives that have been debunked into oblivion at this point. But still, this one persists, so hopefully people start correcting this narrative too after this comes to their attention. If we revisit the interview where Harrison Ford's quote about George Lucas's dialogue actually came from, and trust me, I had to do a lot of digging for it because every single shit-stained media outlet had published an article with the selectively edited quote and not the actual one. What should have been a simple task turned out to be like finding a needle in a haystack. I finally managed to track it down. The origins of the quote come from Time magazine, from the issue released on May 30th, 1977. Harrison Ford says, and I quote, "There were times when I issued a threat to tie George up and make him repeat his own dialogue." Ford told Time magazine, "I told him, you can't say that stuff. You can only type it. But I was wrong. It worked." End fucking quote.
Can you feel that? Huh? Can you feel it?
Captain Compost! Also, while we're on the interview, and make no mistake, we will be coming back to it, here's a little freebie for those clowns insisting that the original Star Wars wasn't made primarily for children, or that it never took inspiration from the 30s and 40s serials for its acting, dialogue, and tone. Well, in that very same vaulted interview from Time magazine, it reads, "A universe of plenty, as audiences can discover beginning this week in Star Wars, a grand and glorious film that may well be the smash hit of 1977. And is the best movie of the year so far. Star Wars is a combination of Flash Gordon, The Wizard of Oz, the Errol Flynn swashbucklers of the 30s and 40s, and almost every Western ever screened. The result is a remarkable confection, a subliminal history of the movies, wrapped in a riveting tale of suspense and adventure, ornamented with some of the most ingenious special effects ever contrived for film. It has no message, no sex, and only the merest dollop of bloodshed here and there. It's aimed at kids, the kid in everybody." It then quotes Lucas, "It's the flotsam and jetsam from the period when I was 12 years old. All the books and films and comics that I liked when I was a child. The plot is simple, good against evil, and the film is designed to be all the fun things and fantasy things I remember. The word for the movie is fun." In the same interview, George goes on to say, "Of course, everybody was right. It's a weird idea to make a movie whose only purpose was to give pleasure," says Lucas. "It's not a film about the future. Star Wars is a fantasy, much closer to the Brothers Grimm than it is to 2001: A Space Odyssey. My main reason for making it was to give young people an honest, wholesome fantasy life, the kind my generation had. We had westerns, pirate movies, all kinds of great things. Now we have the $6 Million Man in Kojak. Where are the romance, the adventure, and the fun that used to be practically in every movie made?" Dated May 30th, 1977, game, set, and match, dipshits.
Jordan fades back, swoosh, and that's the game!
The individuals from this pathetic collective insisting that Star Wars was never meant for kids as a way of sliding George Lucas for the child-friendly tone they didn't appreciate in the prequels, as well as Return of the Jedi for that matter, after the supposedly super dark and ultra-mature, quote-unquote, bestest Star Wars film ever made in The Empire Strikes Back.
I'm backwards, you sleeping bubble!
These people are simply projecting at weapons grade their own perception of what made for children actually means, because they're super defensive about having an unhealthy obsession for what is, by all intents and purposes, a child demographically targeted space fantasy saga. But made for children does not mean made for stupid. Despite the excellent case, this petulant horde of Star Wars imbeciles has spent the course of decades making for that very misconception.
Ironic.
But in actuality, it just so happens that George Lucas respects the intellectual capacity of children.
You know, it's hard for people to realize, and I'm not supposed to say this, and I wasn't supposed to say it then, but, you know, it's a film for 12-year-olds. You're 12 years old, you're going to go on into the big world, you're moving away from your parents being the center focus, you're probably scared, you don't know what's going to happen, and here's a little idea of some of the things you should pay attention to.
One of the reasons why I made Star Wars is it's made for 12-year-olds. It appeals to everybody, but it was still made for 12-year-olds.
We were all 12 once.
And I tell people, don't underestimate 12-year-olds. They're smarter than the rest of us.
Right.
They get stuff much faster than you do.
Truly wonderful the mind of a child is.
Not only does this prove that Star Wars was always considered to be a return to the old-fashioned style of making movies, but returning to Harrison Ford's quote about whilst being apprehensive about George's dialogue at first, and later going on to admit he was wrong, what's also deliberately ignored by the media is that Harrison Ford has publicly gone on record saying that it was a joke. And largely the reason he and others found the dialogue so unnatural is because they didn't know how to bring it out spontaneously. Because they didn't understand what the hell the Star Wars terminology was referencing, since they only had bits and pieces. Once Harrison Ford saw the finished product and understood the full context of what George was trying to make, he admitted that he was wrong and that the dialogue, however strange, worked in the end.
In doing a movie like this, the dialogue, because it is stylized and formalized and yet believable, is it easier for an actor to do something that would be more conversational? You certainly would.
Oh, sure it would, yeah.
You know.
But It was George's constant hand there that kept us convinced that we could get away with this.
Mm. And your confidence is a thing to behold in this movie. Your constant sense of course I can do it, is the old, Jack Armstrong, all-American boy type thing.
It's an actor-proof part.
It also probably didn't help that Harrison Ford never watched any of the adventure serials from the 30s like Flash Gordon that George Lucas grew up with and took his inspirations from, which is likely another reason he found it confusing. And Star Wars had rightfully been compared to comic books when it first came out, due in large part to its cheesiness and wacky dialogue.
It's interesting, people are talking about this film in the same breath as comic books all the time. You hear that comparison frequently. Is that an apt one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not something you can consider as an actor. I mean, you have to wipe your slate clean of that kind of stuff and just go and do your job.
Have you always been a kind of Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, sci-fi fan?
No, I never have. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever seen one of those Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon series.
Well, now we have something in common, Harrison, because
you haven't either.
No, I never read that stuff when I was a kid.
Neither did I.
Never interested me, as a matter of fact. And I've never.
Well, George did. But this is George's movie, and George was able to write something which was accessible to my intelligence so that I could come up with something that I'd never seen before.
But make no mistake, that dialogue, just like with the prequels, was done with the same intention and the same purpose as the dialogue in the original trilogy. Another example of cast members from the original trilogy sharing their displeasure of working with George's dialogue, that's often used by some as quote-unquote proof that Lucas supposedly had no idea what he was doing writing the script for the first Star Wars film, and that it was other people that had to quote-unquote fix it for him, is this infamous clip of Mark Hamill from 1977 when he discusses a line from the Star Wars script that he supposedly had to quote-unquote beg George Lucas to cut out of the screenplay.
The dialogue was a little bit difficult. I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out of the screenplay, and he finally did. And it's when, the line? Yes, boy, I'll never forget it as long as I live. I sometimes dream about this line. It was just coming upon the exploded planet of the Princess Alderaan, and it's totally been blown away. And Harrison says, "Look, kid, I've done my part of the bargain. When I get to an asteroid, you, the old man, and the droids get dropped off." And my line was, "But we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Anomaly or Sullust, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault." And I thought, who talks like this, George?
Now, this is often propagated by certain scumbag Star Wars original trilogy fanatics with a chip on their shoulder who love to misrepresent what Mark Hamill is saying here, or who just simply have no idea what they're talking about, or just shitty-ass fucking journalists who embody all of the above.
I've come across people that have no imaginations at all, and it's a very interesting...
They become journalists.
And granted, a lot of the blame for this should go directly on Mark Hamill, even though he's simply just recounting funny moments from his time filming Star Wars, just to simply entertain people in good faith. In doing so, he tells a very misleading version of what actually happened, and people have simply taken his words in extremely bad faith, and are using it to run with their own agenda against George Lucas. The way Mark Hamill tells this story, it makes it seem like they were in the middle of filming the approach to the Death Star during principal photography, instead of where this story actually came from, which was Mark Hamill's original screen test for Star Wars. Though admittedly, Hamill does mention that this line did come from the screen test and not the actual screenplay during principal photography in the famous documentary Star Wars Empire of Dreams.
I can remember a line from the screen test, which I don't think ever will leave me. Luke says, "But we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Anomaly or Sullust, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault."
It's funny how this very misleading retelling from 1977 is the quote-unquote evidence that the internet loves to propagate en masse, especially shitty-ass YouTubers. They'll use this clip to pull the wool over people's eyes in order to reinforce their pitiful fucking narrative, instead of this far more accurate clip that, tells the truth.
I know, right?
But as I've said, these individuals actively avoid dealing in the truth because it's the only way they are able to maintain their incredibly fragile narrative against Lucas that's about as sturdy as a house of cards. In regards to Empire of Dreams, however, while there are several sugar-coated or romanticized retellings of events in the documentary from behind the scenes on the making of Star Wars, which we will come back to, however, Mark Hamill's account in this particular instance is not one of them. And in a more recent interview, Mark Hamill speaks even more candidly on the original screen test and what actually happened.
I thought I'd go back to the very beginning, my original audition. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. All right, and here we go. This was the first day I ever met Harrison Ford, by the way. I went to George just before we filmed this, because I was trying to figure out, I said, are we sort of sending up, is this like a parody, of Flash Gordon, and George said, let's just shoot it and we'll talk about it later. What it meant was, let's just shoot it and we'll never talk about it later.
Fear is their greatest defense.
Here.
I doubt if the actual security there is much greater than on Apple or Sullus, and what there is most likely directed towards a large single assault.
Who talks like this?
To put this in perspective, this was Mark Hamill's first introduction to the incredibly strange and difficult, otherworldly 1930s-style Star Wars space fantasy dialogue, which Hamill has confirmed in an interview that he was only given an out-of-context portion of the script that only included the specific scene he'd be reading for in that very same screen test, where he first encountered this nightmarish line, as he likes to refer to it as. Though, just to further cleanse the shitty waters of this incredibly murky narrative that people like to push about Mark Hamill supposedly hating George's dialogue, in the section of J.W. Rinzler's Making of Star Wars book that goes into detail about Mark Hamill's screen test, an early interview transcribed in the book has Hamill saying, quote, "There was one great line though, and it was the hardest piece of dialogue I'd ever memorized." And then he goes on to mention the line in question. So yeah, make of that what you will. The larger point being made here is that Hamill understandably struggled with the screen test, not necessarily because of the quality of the writing, which I'll come back to because I'm not done with that notion yet, but like the rest of the cast and their first exposure to any kind of Star Wars material, he just didn't have the faintest clue of what he was talking about.
And by the way, all through the shoot, people were going, is it Han or Han? Is it Chewbacca or Chewbacca? We'd ask George, because he didn't really care. He said, well, just say it the way you want to say it, it'll be regional. I mean, can you imagine all that he has on his mind trying to get this movie off the ground, and we're nitpicking about how you pronounce the name of the Wookiee? Prioritize, folks.
And I had Ralph McQuarrie doing drawings of what I wanted everything to look like, because, again, you can't read the script and understand what I'm talking about. It has to be a picture. Because what does a Wookiee look like? What do the spaceships look like?
Yeah.
All that stuff had to be figured out ahead of time.
And since the screen test took place in 1975, Mark Hamill was undoubtedly referring to the third draft version of the script for Star Wars A New Hope, meaning a much more primitive version of both the story and dialogue than what was to appear in the final cut.
When I did this scene, I thought Han Solo was the lead character, and I was the sidekick. Harrison was a bona fide leading man, so I thought he was Captain America and I was Bucky. So when I eventually got the script, and I opened to the front page, it said, The Star Wars, The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, as taken from the Saga of the Whills. I realized, oh my gosh, it's through my eyes.
And to give you a small idea of just how primitive this version of the script is, Tatooine was still called Utapau, the Millennium Falcon didn't even have a name yet, and Han Solo's original introduction as well as the Greedo scene weren't even written at the time.
If this robot has information related to the destruction of Organa Major, you'll be able to name the reward.
Notice I said robot, not droid. That would come later.
So what these people are perceiving as Mark Hamill saving Star Wars from the dreaded dialogue of George Lucas at the last possible moment during filming the actual scene, that is, if we are to believe Mark Hamill's very questionable retelling of events, was simply Mark Hamill making a helpful suggestion to Lucas months before principal photography even began for a much, much earlier draft of the script for a line that was likely never going to come close to making the final cut of the movie anyway, because it went through 2 additional rewrites in both the 4th draft version and the revised 4th draft version, aka the shooting script for Star Wars A New Hope, as well as additional tweaks and changes during principal photography, which is a process that is just par for the course in the film industry.
The line is, "I'll come back." It wasn't meant to be like a big moment at all. It was literally meant to be on its face, no problem, I'll come back. For some reason, Arnold didn't say, "I'll come back." I said, well, just say, "I'll be back."
I said, "Jim, to me it sounds funny when I say, 'I'll be back.' It sounds much more machine-like if I would say, 'I will be back.'" And he says, "Are you the writer?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, don't tell me how to fucking write. I'll be back." It became the most quoted movie line, I think, in the history of motion pictures. So this just shows to you who was right and who was wrong.
But that's not even the most hilariously misleading aspect of Mark Hamill's story.
Wait until you hear this one.
Now, if you feel like indulging some of the most illness-inducing brain rot from Star Wars fans, just take a look at the comments left under footage of Mark Hamill's infamous interview, and you'll be subjected to hordes of internet pseudo-intellectuals spewing copious amounts of sludge about George Lucas's ability to write dialogue based on this very misleading story. A common phrase that's uttered by these empty-headed morons is, to paraphrase here, "This is why the prequels suffered. Oh, if only there were more people like Mark to save us from George Lucas's writing." Or, you know, some stupid shit like that. But one of the more constructive comments I've seen is how the line is supposedly terrible because it doesn't suit Luke's character, because he's just a simple farmhand who shouldn't know about military space tactics. And that's actually a very good point, although with one very major problem. See, as it turns out, the line that Mark Hamill hated so much, the line that was so bad it still haunts his dreams till this very day, the line that so many George Lucas detractors cling to as their bread and butter for how the original trilogy was quote-unquote saved from him by his cast and crew because he supposedly didn't understand his own characters, plot, and story, that terrible line that Mark Hamill begged George Lucas to remove from the 3rd draft of the script, that wasn't Luke Starkiller's line, it was actually Ben Kenobi's line. Yes, Mark Hamill was actually reading a line that was meant for Ben Kenobi, because even though he was auditioning for Luke Skywalker, he was also simply standing in for Sir Alec Guinness, who wasn't available for the screen test on that day. If Star Wars didn't already sound strange with the 1930s-style otherworldly dialogue from a script that was out of context and isolated to one scene with zero frame of reference for how anything looked, or just what the hell anything was, from a much earlier, unrefined draft of the script for Star Wars A New Hope, I'd imagine it sounded even stranger if you were reading for a character you weren't even auditioning for. Now, with all this in mind, and just in case I have to spell it out for you, none of this is any negative reflection on George Lucas. No matter how some people will undoubtedly try to spin it, it's just a narrative constructed from a bad faith interpretation of Mark Hamill's very misleading story that's being used to satiate the pathetic agenda of those who wish to discredit George Lucas. Because they had an equally bad faith reaction to lines that appropriately made use of the word yippee and sand in his newer entries to the franchise. Horror. Not to mention, despite these same individuals bitching about a certain character being designed for children, they also somehow lack the maturity themselves to keep a cartoon rabbit from haunting their dreams 20 years later. And somehow these are the same individuals who claim to be the intellectual authority on the matter, and expect to be taken seriously.
Really makes you think.
One last thing, but for all the online dogshit discourse that empty-headed YouTubers and journalists love to propagate about Mark Hamill supposedly hating George's dialogue and flaunting this interview clip that's built on misinformation, which they've gone one step further and twisted into a lie.
The dialogue was a little bit difficult. I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out of the screenplay, and he finally did.
But how exactly could Mark Hamill have begged George Lucas to remove the line from the script when in regards to the screen test, he very contradictively says,
I went to George just before we filmed this, because I was trying to figure out, I said, are we sort of sending up, is this like a parody, of Flash Gordon, and George said, let's just shoot it and we'll talk about it later. What it meant was, let's just shoot it and we'll never talk about it later.
And again, in Rinzler's book, Hamill kind of paints the opposite picture, that he was in fact fond of the line despite its difficulty. But I digress. With all that said, the equally important thing to remember is Lucas did as all great filmmakers do. He refined his work through rewrites and collaboration, which is something he did for all 6 of his Star Wars films, which I will further elaborate on at length as this video progresses. However, what truly annoys me, and should annoy any genuine fan of Star Wars, is how these certain types of Star Wars fanatics, as well as bottom-feeding content creators and journalists...
I've come across people that have no imaginations at all, and it's a very interesting...
They become journalists.
These parasites love to jump on any ammunition they can, whether it's true or not, to discredit Lucas despite the fact that he created the franchise and made it into what it was, in order to push this silly hair-splitting agenda for why it's okay for them to cherish his earlier Star Wars movies but not his newer films, because they were supposedly quote-unquote saved from him by other people. But they'll make sure to deliberately ignore the many examples where the opposite is proven to be the case. However, the lesser-known stories about the original cast collaborating with George Lucas that these same degenerates refuse to talk about because it contradicts their narrative is, just as one example, this instance of Mark Hamill suggesting extra dialogue for a scene, which would have been redundant, and George Lucas having to put his foot down and telling Hamill, "Don't worry, they'll get it. The viewers aren't idiots." And which scene was that, might you all wonder? Oh, it's nothing really, just one of the most iconic entrances of all time. Yes, Mark Hamill suggested something quite different for this scene.
The storytelling is so primal. It's good versus evil, and it's very clear, even to the youngest viewer. I remember saying to George I wanted to see Darth Vader's first entrance, even though I didn't work that day. And I said, George, why aren't you cutting away to 2 characters saying, oh, that's the Dark Lord of the Sith, he's the most powerful evil. He goes, no, well, it's got a white background, he comes on in a black costume, we'll play some scary music, they'll get it. I thought, wow, what economical storytelling.
Yeah, that kind of tosses a wrench into the whole cast and crew saving George Lucas from himself narrative. The biggest problem with this notion of George Lucas needing others to save his work is that under the same criteria, this can be applied to every single filmmaker ever. Because every filmmaker out there, some obviously better than others, has always needed collaborators. There's this bizarre coping mechanism which is used by some that film collaborators, only in regards to Star Wars, is the reason they liked the earlier movies, the dialogue very much included. And of course, they don't seem to apply this to other works of art. But the irony is that when it comes to collaborators on Star Wars, and especially when it comes to George Lucas, since he funded all but the first film entirely on his own, which was received with unanimous praise, and the fact that George Lucas has always strived to tell people to get fucked when they demand he make changes to his work, let me make something very clear to all of you. Nobody can tell George Lucas no when it comes to Star Wars. He does whatever he sees fit. Nothing makes it into the movie without his say-so. be it an actor's helpful suggestion or a terrible one. Case in point, Mark Hamill allegedly telling George Lucas if a line that didn't even belong to his character from a much earlier draft of Star Wars that was never intended to be in the final movie would be better off removed, or if he thinks the movie should have dialogue it doesn't need, or Harrison Ford improvising a line in Empire Strikes Back, which we'll get to, or Harrison Ford insisting that his beloved character should die at the end of the trilogy, which, by the way, George Lucas firmly put a stop to, because he absolutely knows when to collaborate and when to tell his collaborators to stick their idea up their arse, like all good filmmakers do. Though, of course, I'd imagine he does this in the most polite George Lucas way possible.
You can get popped on the head real quick.
A key issue was whether Harrison Ford, who is now equally famous for the role of Indiana Jones, would return as Han Solo.
The other actors after Star Wars had signed on to do 2 more because I wanted to finish the whole thing. Harrison did not. He had the idea, why don't you kill him off? Why don't you kill him off?
I thought Han Solo should die. I thought he ought to sacrifice himself for the other 2 characters.
I also felt someone had to go. You know, I felt someone had to die. And George was against it. And George knew what he wanted, and he got what he wanted.
Hey, it's me.
Ah yes, just another example of the genius cast and crew saving George Lucas from himself. But in regards to the original trilogy cast having only the worst to say about the dialogue of Star Wars, the only member of the cast that couldn't stand the dialogue of Star Wars outright, at least from as far as my research has taken me, was Alec Guinness, who liked Star Wars as a concept and story, but has made it publicly known that he hated the idea of having roles in fantasy and science fiction, the dialogue being very much a part of that.
And a script arrived on my dressing table, and I heard that it had been delivered by George Lucas, and I thought, well, that's rather impressive, because he's an up-and-coming and very respect-worthy young director, so... And then when I opened it and found it was science fiction, I thought, oh, crumbs, this is simply not for me. And then I started reading, and it seemed to me the dialogue was pretty ropey. But I had to go on turning the page. And I mean, that's an essential in any script. You've got to know what happens next, or what's going to be said next. And I went on reading, and I thought, no, I like this. If only we can get some of the dialogue altered. And then I met him, we got on very well, and I found myself doing it, that's all.
It's also worth noting that, just like with Mark Hamill, the first script that Alec Guinness encountered for Star Wars was indeed the same third draft script that was used for the screen testing of the main 3 actors, which at that point in time was in the middle of being refined into the next draft, and was certainly far removed from what George Lucas was intending for the finished shooting script. Returning to that same interview with Charles Lippincott, which took place on December 17th, 1975, prior to Mark Hamill's screen test, Lippincott asks Lucas if he'd had any luck with Sir Alec Guinness, to which Lucas simply responds with, quote-unquote, "We are negotiating." And more to the point, the whole reason Lippincott conducted this interview was because Star Wars was finally given the green light to go ahead, and production had reached a critical turning point. Lucas was in the middle of casting the film, and was in the middle of rewriting a 4th draft of the script. Lippincott asked him in regards to the characters, quote, "What are you trying to reach with them now?" And Lucas responds with, quote, "Essentially, I'm trying to knock out all of the plot loopholes, and I'm trying to smooth it out and add more intensity to the film, make it work better. I'm trying to make the characters more interesting and more enjoyable." End quote. Which is also pretty damn telling of how Lucas had moved his priorities away from story and character creation into story and character refinement with his script writing, the dialogue very much included. And over the course of 2 years in trying to develop the damn script, he finally settled on the story he wanted. But the bottom line is, what these actors were referring to in these interviews that George Lucas detractors love to regurgitate en masse and out of context, in a very slimy effort to try and discredit the man, is in fact based on a draft that was far from what George Lucas had intended for the final cut of the film, and the excellent script we actually got. People seem to use this as like the Achilles heel for the notion that George Lucas can be a competent writer, because Alec Guinness didn't like the dialogue and didn't think much of it. But it's very clear that Alec Guinness just wasn't that into Star Wars. He made some helpful suggestions to Lucas, who was open enough to take it on board.
The day before the film opened in San Francisco, George Lucas phoned me and said, he's like Alan Bennett, he's very diffident and very shy and quiet, and he has a funny little voice. And he said, I think the movie's kind of going to be all right. And I said, oh, I'm glad, George. And he said, yeah, the press quite like it. I said, good. He said, we're pleased with, very grateful for little alterations you suggested. And
probably the biggest of which was the introduction of Obi-Wan Kenobi as a wise, sage-like figure, instead of introducing him as a crazy old man that was putting on a cheap facade. Sound familiar?
I'm looking for someone. Found someone you have, I would say. Fine.
The boy has no patience.
You will learn patience.
Yoda.
Guinness thought Obi-Wan should remain wise throughout his entire involvement in the film, but originally Obi-Wan wasn't meant to get killed off, he was meant to train Luke in Empire Strikes Back. In fact, Alec Guinness apparently lobbied to get killed off in the original film, the biggest reason for which was he couldn't stand the quote-unquote rubbish dialogue. And it's very clear that the crazy old man facade for Obi-Wan was simply repurposed for Yoda in Empire Strikes Back. And as we all know, that idea, which was George Lucas's idea, worked perfectly.
In the original story that came out of New Hope, at this point in the story, Obi-Wan Kenobi counseled Luke on how to become a Jedi and the nature of the Force and to really learn about the Force. But because of the situation in New Hope, I decided that there wasn't very much for Obi-Wan Kenobi to do in the last part of the picture, and I felt it would be more dramatic to kill him off, and that I would then figure out what to do in the next movie when I got there. So here I was in the next movie, in this section, the middle part of the section where Luke learns to use the Force from a Jedi who was supposed to be Obi-Wan, and I'd killed him off, so I couldn't do that anymore. So I invented this new Jedi, Yoda, and in order to sustain what I figured was going to be a lot of long, talky scenes, I wanted to make him a rather unique alien character, so he was fun to watch. And because he was supposedly one of the greatest Jedi of all time, I wanted to make him very small and very un-Jedi looking, so that it would be a real surprise when you discovered that this funny little frog-like creature on the side of the road, so to speak, turns out to be this great Jedi Master. But it really came out of the problem I had in killing off Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first movie. Not technically killing him off, but having him join the Force at will. The issue of consciously joining the Force, which is a theme that runs through these films, and being able to retain your personality, your individuality, once you've gone over to the other side, is part of the story that gets explained in the first three films. And here it's becomes kind of a mystery because it's never really explained how and why that happens.
So while Guinness made the suggestion to change the character in A New Hope to be a wise, sage-like figure for the entire duration, there's plausible evidence to show the alternative might have worked out as well. But regardless, Lucas did end up taking the advice on board, and even though Obi-Wan wasn't initially meant to be killed off in A New Hope, according to various sources, which again, given all that we've discussed about disingenuous, agenda-driven, scumbag journalists, and the stories they like to spin on the internet,
You fucking journal!
I'd suggest taking it with a heavy grain of salt, and you'll soon see why. But Guinness welcomed the change because he'd had enough of spouting the Star Wars mumbo-jumbo. Because again, he didn't understand what the hell he was saying. A sentiment shared by none other than Guinness's fellow actor, Peter Cushing, who, if we take a look at this excerpt from Rinzler's Making of Star Wars book, had this to say, and this excerpt is taken from the section of the book that discusses Tarkin's meeting with Leia on the Death Star. It reads, "While Carrie struggled to muster her anger, Cushing, like his compatriot Alec Guinness, was trying to make sense of his lines. Quote, "There was a great deal of the script I didn't understand," he says. Quote, "especially all the technical jargon, and I wasn't alone. Many of the stagehands came up to me and asked, 'What is all this about? I can't understand a word of it.' I told them, quote, 'Neither can I. I'm just saying the lines and trying to sound intelligent.'"
You can't read the script and understand what I'm talking about. It has to be a picture. Because what does a Wookiee look like? What do the spaceships look like?
I gather from what I've been told that my very dear friend, whom I loved very much, was a wonderful human being as well as being a magnificent actor, the late and much lamented Peter Cushing. I gather he reappears in this. Don't ask me how, I don't know. Of course, he was in the first Star Wars film. I always remember, after I'd seen him in the Star Wars picture, I rang him up and I said, "What on earth is a Grand Moff Tarkin?" He said, "I haven't the faintest idea." I don't think he ever asked George why he was called that. But then George's imagination is unlike anything I think I've ever come across. It's unbelievable. My own history, just one person, one character in the Star Wars saga. I've got 4 or 5 pages about Dooku, where he was born, the things that he invented. He was born on a planet called Sereno. And all these different characters have different elements. Everyone has a reason for being who they are. It's quite amazing. It really is.
Not to mention, again, in regards to Sir Alec Guinness, he wasn't a fan of science fiction and fantasy.
I just finished literally on the last day of a film when the script arrived, and I thought, oh, George Lucas, that's, a name to conjure with in the avant-garde thing. And then I opened it and saw it was science fiction. I thought, not for me. Started to read it and was held although the dialogue was appalling, but there was something about it which made you go on turning the pages. Now that's fairly rare in a script. When I met Lucas, we could talk the same language, I think. And I enjoyed doing it. But I don't think anyone had much confidence in the picture, except in a funny way me. I didn't know it was going to be that success, but I heard now and then people disparaging the work, and I would say, no, you mark my words, it's being done with great taste and imagination.
And he certainly didn't watch any of the old 1930s and 40s serials that George Lucas took his inspiration and style from. Not to mention, Guinness lobbied for the change after his suggestions to his own character's dialogue had been made. Though, once again, if we go back to Rinzler's book and the events that transpired during the making of the film, it tells a somewhat contradictory account of how Alec Guinness actually felt about the sudden change in the story and the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Side note, this film had such a disastrous production that among the many complications that affected it, Lucas's typewriter actually broke, and apparently he had to quickly finish the revised 4th draft of the script while borrowing a manual French typewriter from one of his secretaries and had to scratch and claw his way through food poisoning in order to get it done. Seriously, this, along with all the other shit he had to put up with, it's no wonder that Lucas was traumatized from his experience making this movie. Anyway, the first part of this story is an excerpt from the section of Rinzler's book that discusses the final days of the grueling shoot in Tunisia. It reads, quote, "I took Alec aside and told him that I was going to kill him off halfway through the picture," Lucas recalls. Quote, "It's quite a big shock to an actor when you say, I know you have a big part, and you are going to the end and be a hero and everything, and all of a sudden I have decided to kill you." Alec was a very brilliant man, but he was also an actor, and very emotional, very human. He then quotes Guinness, whose response was apparently, "You mean I get killed, but I don't have a death scene?" He said, but he kept it under control. And Lucas's quote ends there. The last line of this excerpt reads, "Under control for the meantime." The part 2 of this story comes from a later excerpt from a section of the book that discusses the first week of filming in England, where Alec Guinness almost walked out of the film because he apparently disliked the change so much. It reads as follows. The biggest problem, potentially a film-destroying event, had to be counteracted by Lucas during a strategic lunch on one of their first days back. In the intervening time between Tunisia and his arrival at the studio in London, Guinness had mulled over the death of Obi-Wan and was not at all happy about it. Quote, "We went to a restaurant and sat down," Lucas says. "He was terribly upset. He was ready to walk off the picture." Lucas then quotes Alec Guinness. He said, quote, "I'm not doing this." Lucas goes on. He didn't like the idea of being a ghost. That's the part he really didn't like. The idea of giving yourself up willingly to join the Force. So I had to convince him to come back on the picture. That was a very long lunch, during which I had to explain why I was doing it and what I was doing and how. I explained that in the last half of the movie, he didn't have anything to do. It wasn't dramatic to have him standing around, and I wanted his character to have an impact. Once I explained it was much better for the movie, he looked at it and said, quote, "You're right. This is much better," end quote. Lucas goes on. He started to think about what he was going to have to be doing and how it would have been embarrassing to simply be standing around without much purpose. In regards to the change, Lucas is quoted saying the following. The idea of Ben going on afterward as part of the Force was a thematic idea that was in the earliest scripts, Lucas adds. Quote, "It was a really Castaneda Tales of Power thing," end quote. Afterwards, Guinness spoke to Hamill, who says, quote, "Alec thought it would be far more effective if he sacrificed himself," end quote. Now, as I said, that telling of events is more than just a bit contradictory to Guinness's thoughts on the making of Star Wars in the years leading up to his death. Granted, these somewhat disdainful accounts have been cited as coming from his own autobiography and personal letters, so either these journalists are not telling the full truth, which wouldn't surprise me at all, or it is in fact accurate and Guinness simply hated the change for other reasons. Lucas does make it clear that Guinness's big contention was the fact that he didn't want the character to linger on as a ghost, which I suppose does fall somewhat in line with him advocating for the killing off of his character and his distaste for the quote-unquote rubbish dialogue, though based on this account, I have absolutely no idea how Guinness could have possibly suggested getting his character killed off for the expressed purpose of being a far more effective mystical mentor if George Lucas had to take the guy out for lunch and convince him to stick around because he hated the idea of his character remaining part of the story from beyond the grave. But regardless of how Sir Alec Guinness felt about the dialogue and his part in Star Wars, maybe he loved it, maybe he hated it, maybe he loved it originally and then slowly grew to hate it because of the bitter aftertaste the movie left on his life and career. Certainly not financially, of course, but my point is this: how Sir Alec Guinness felt about the quote-unquote rubbish dialogue is largely irrelevant given the fact that he mostly didn't understand what the hell he was even contributing to. Not even particularly being a fan of fantasy and science fiction as a whole, and certainly unfamiliar with the style of dialogue and filmmaking that George Lucas was drawing his inspirations from. But despite that, and as we all know, Obi-Wan's dialogue in Star Wars A New Hope is some of the most widely quoted and cherished dialogue in the history of cinema.
You know him? Well, of course I know him. He's me. An elegant weapon for a more civilized age. Before the dark times. Before the Empire. I felt a great disturbance in the Force.
I could almost see the remote.
That's good. You've taken your first step into a larger world. The Force will be with you. Always.
He's also arguably the best part of the film, so Alec Guinness saying that he hated the dialogue or that it was rubbish for a character he had very little interest in, for a genre he doesn't care for that went on to become a huge success with the audience, as well as the fact that most of Alec Guinness's public criticisms about the Star Wars dialogue were levied at a far more primitive script that was never intended to be in the final cut, coming from him it really isn't saying much. And that's no disrespect for Alec Guinness, understand, but it's quite obvious that Star Wars simply wasn't his cup of tea. The fact of the matter is this: George Lucas is just like any other filmmaker who always collaborates with people. It's not a case of him only selectively collaborating when fans decide there's an aspect of his work that they consider to be of a higher level of quality than his other movies. That is simply a regurgitated myth. It's for this very reason that people have resigned themselves to this notion that it was only prior to the prequels where George had people on set that had to quote-unquote save him from himself, and they'll cite a few select examples where George has taken a suggestion or two from someone else as evidence that his whole movie was saved thanks to other people. The biggest example of them doing this is The Empire Strikes Back, where there was one notable dialogue change that was made when Irvin Kershner allowed Harrison Ford to improvise one line.
I love you.
I know.
Now, unlike what most shitty content creators and media websites would have you believe, the way these events unfolded on the set of The Empire Strikes Back has been grossly misrepresented by certain Star Wars fans. And to be fair, the retelling of this story has been somewhat romanticized by Irvin Kershner and Harrison Ford in interviews and documentaries in the years since. Most notably in the documentary Empire of Dreams, which these same individuals love to take out of context and in very bad faith, out of sheer spite, and to reinforce this narrative that George Lucas doesn't know how to write dialogue.
George had scripted an exchange between Princess Leia and Han Solo, which went like this. She said, "I love you," and Han Solo said, "I love you too."
Liar! We tried take after take after take. Nothing satisfied me.
Kind of seemed to me that we weren't taking advantage of the character that we'd established for Han Solo.
And finally, I said, Harrison, don't think about it. Don't think about it. Let's do it. Okay, action.
I love you.
I know.
I said, yeah, it's a great line.
Liar! However, according to J.W. Rinzler's novel, The Making of the Empire Strikes Back, there is a transcribed recording of the conversations that took place that day on the set of Star Wars Episode 5, and Harrison Ford's line didn't just come out of thin air the way that Kershner and Ford said that it did. As a matter of fact, the line had been discussed and rehearsed without the inclusion of Carrie Fisher. Oh, we'll get to that. But this line didn't just fall into Harrison Ford's lap in the heat of the moment. And not only that, but unlike Harrison Ford's recounting of events in later interviews and documentaries, according to the shooting script of Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo's original reply to Leia wasn't, quote, "I love you too," which many ESB fanboys have chastised Lucas for because he supposedly didn't understand the character of Han Solo.
Are you serious?
Instead, Lucas's approved version for the shooting script of Empire Strikes Back reads as follows. Leia to Han, quote, "I love you. I couldn't tell you before, but it's true." To which Han Solo replies with, quote, "Just remember that, 'cause I'll be back." In classic, glorious Han Solo fashion. That was Lucas's approved line, and the original intended line for the final cut. And if you think that doesn't sound like something that Han Solo would say, you need your fucking head examined. And that was the Lucas approved line. There were many takes of this scene, several of which possessed the original line from the shooting script. The final take was the one that possessed Harrison Ford's rewrite. So there were multiple versions of this scene that were filmed. But Kershner and Ford wanted to trim down the exchange and make it simpler. And this is the version they felt most comfortable with showing Lucas for the rough cut. Now, Lucas initially disagreed with the change with the very respectable standpoint of fearing that the line would come across as a joke and would ruin the emotional climax of the scene, which is understandable given that the scene was meant to be an emotional farewell. However, Ford and Kershner were adamant that this was the way to go, and according to Kershner, Lucas decided to do 2 test screenings. The first would be the rewrite version, and the second would be the scripted version, which resulted in Lucas not even bothering with a second screening because the audience was so taken with the line. And according to Harrison Ford, Lucas generously agreed to keep it, meaning it was his final call in the end. Also, while we're on the subject, Lawrence Kasdan, who again is who many of these same disingenuous douchebags like to credit for the majority of the success for The Empire Strikes Back. Just for the record, he too wasn't all that pleased with Harrison Ford's rewrite of the Carbonite scene, not to mention several other changes to the Han and Leia romance scenes as well, that he had apparently worked on. Kinda throws yet another wrench into their narrative that Lawrence Kasdan was the true genius behind Empire Strikes Back.
Solo.
You stupid.
As this video has no doubt demonstrated up to this point, contrary to what some like to believe, changing lines from earlier drafts and even the shooting script during filming is very common when it comes to making movies, as well as weighing up which takes to use in the final cut of a film. Once again, for whatever reason, Star Wars just possesses this hyper-fixated lens with little to no actual frame of reference, particularly by those who want to discredit George Lucas under the guise of educating people. They seem to be operating under the delusion that Kershner and Ford snuck this line into the final cut against George's wishes and without telling him, when the whole reason they took multiple takes of this scene was so in case they just so happened to be wrong, George wouldn't roast their testicles over an open fire.
Right. And so we shot...
You shot one like that, right?
Well, we shot one, just for protection, where I spoke the line as written. And George, I think that this is fair enough to say, he went apeshit. He thought it was horrible and that it would get a bad laugh. So I was obliged to sit next to him when he tested it for the first screening. There was a laugh, but it was a laugh of recognition. And so he generously let it.
Well, that says a lot too. That somebody could recognize that and see that, and I think that's honestly that's the art of what I think a good director, or in that case producer, does is stay open, because inevitably the scene you love the most, the line you love the most, is the one that's going to ruin the movie, and you can't be stuck.
Sure, Lucas was initially displeased in the rough cut, not because he necessarily hated the line, but because he thought it wouldn't get the desired reaction for the scene. And yeah, Harrison Ford has gone on record saying that George went supposedly apeshit over it, but at the same time, Harrison Ford is also the one who's constantly mistelling the story.
And finally, the princess reveals her great love for him, and her line is, "I love you." And George had artfully contrived for Han Solo to say, "I love you too."
Right. No, not for you.
Well, I thought it was a lost opportunity.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, this character never behaved so unabashedly emotional and conventional before, and I thought, are we pissing away this great opportunity for the character? You want your badasses to be a badass to the end. You want them to go down the way they lived. So I said, I mean, what's the last thing a woman wants to hear when she says, "I love you"? She says, "I love you," and I say, "I know."
And not to throw stones here, but he and Kershner clearly love retelling it in a way that makes it look like they had to rescue the scene from George Lucas's hatchet job, instead of just slightly tweaking the already established exchange to make it come across less florid to the audience. Not to mention, Harrison Ford seems to have a flair for embellishing.
I said to George, "You can type this stuff, but you can't say it. Move your mouth while you're talking, while you're typing it." And I couldn't say it. It took me like 15 takes.
So I'm choosing to take that whole apeshit reaction from George with a heavy grain of salt. Look, the bottom line is, Lucas indulged their proposal, open to collaborating, just like he did on A New Hope, Return of the Jedi, and yes, including the Star Wars prequels as well, as you'll soon see. But once his concerns were alleviated, he allowed the line into the final cut. It's as simple as that. Just because he wasn't initially in favor of the line doesn't mean he didn't understand the character or know what he was doing. And I mentioned before that there is a lengthy transcript of the conversation that took place on the set of Empire Strikes Back during the Carbonite scene in Rinzler's book. But Rinzler was simply abbreviating the transcript for his book, derived from the primary account that transcribed the conversation, which was Alan Arnold, who was given access to the production of Empire Strikes Back for his own book called Once Upon a Galaxy, The Journal of the Making of Empire Strikes Back, which came out all the way back in 1980. And given that Rinzler consciously cut out certain sections of the conversation because it would have gone on far too long, for his own book, which was trying to provide the most informative and concise account of the events that took place, this next section of the conversation between Kirshner and Ford wasn't included in Rinzler's book, at least as far as I've checked. And sadly, I don't have first-hand access to Alan Arnold's book myself, but if this source is accurate, then Irvin Kershner, the quote-unquote true genius of Empire Strikes Back...
Oh my god, my insides are on fire!
Who again, Lawrence Kasdan, the other quote-unquote true genius...
No, please, no more.
Who disagreed with him about changing several of the romantic lines he'd worked on for the script... Yes, I know this baby boomer Gen X Star Wars revisionism has many, many holes in it, and this is just another one to add to the pile, but according to Arnold's book, Kershner himself was initially in favor of the shooting script line, saying that, quote, the "I'll be back" for Han Solo was an almost contractual obligation for the character. Now again, same principle. This didn't mean that Kershner didn't necessarily know what he was doing. Well, not this time anyway, since he and Kurtz nearly sunk the whole fucking franchise, which is also a story that has been sugar-coated in the Star Wars Empire of Dreams documentary.
The biggest problem I had is it just wasn't going fast enough, and I was running out of money. Irvin Kershner was an extremely good director, but the film went over budget, went over schedule, and all the money I had in Star Wars was committed to this film plus more.
As Rinzler's excellent book on The Empire Strikes Back discusses in great detail, the incompetence between both director Irvin Kershner and Gary Kurtz, which led to Empire having an extremely troubled production that went almost 2 months behind schedule, as well as millions and millions of dollars over budget, and would likely have sunk the entire movie as well as the franchise, had George Lucas not stepped into a more hands-on role supervising the set during principal photography to get the film back on track. Now, these events in question, which are also abbreviated in this article, that much like Rinzler's book tells a far less sugar-coated version of what actually happened during production on The Empire Strikes Back than what was on display for the public in the Empire of Dreams documentary, and sheds a ton of light on quote-unquote true genius Irvin Kershner not using the time allotted to him wisely, overindulging himself on George Lucas's dollar, and constantly changing his mind last minute, frustrating production staff to no end. It also details quote-unquote true genius Gary Kurtz being a complete and utter pussy, constantly walking around on eggshells, and instead deciding to commit a ton of resources and time to what Kershner needed to feel comfortable, instead of doing his damn job, reining Kershner in, as a producer is meant to when necessary, and ensure that the production schedule for Empire stayed on track. Matter of fact, Gary Kurtz is one of the original trilogy alumni that this pathetic demographic of older generation fans, as well as their copycats, cling to when it comes to discrediting Lucas, saying that it was thanks to Gary Kurtz that George Lucas succeeded with Star Wars A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, before Lucas showed cracks of decline with Return of the Jedi, before supposedly completely and utterly failing as a filmmaker with the special editions and the prequels, because the brilliant mastermind Gary Kurtz, who was so incompetent he nearly sunk the franchise, as well as the quote-unquote bestest Star Wars movie ever, that these simpletons fawn over for all the wrong reasons. Yeah, all the stuff they didn't like apparently happened because that guy wasn't around to keep Lucas in check and quote-unquote save him from himself. When, and especially in regards to Empire, it's the opposite that's true.
I know, right?
And shamefully enough, much of this ridiculous notion of Lucas supposedly being an unreasonable dictator that surrounded himself with yes men actually comes from an extremely questionable revisionist account from Gary Kurtz himself that this same collective of certain disingenuous douchebags from the Star Wars fanbase love to clip and use out of context to put Gary Kurtz up on this pedestal as one of the unsung quote-unquote true geniuses behind the success of Star Wars, but this very bitter and misleading account from an incompetent producer that was basically fired from any future Star Wars projects because of his incompetence pales in legitimacy when stacked up against many respective alternate accounts and sources that refute Kurtz's claims and tell a very different and far more accurate story about what Gary Kurtz was like as a producer on both Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back.
The clashes between Kurtz and Lucas are known among most fans who have a passing familiarity with Star Wars history. However, the real reasons behind why such clashes developed and how early they started developing is still lost on some, thanks in part to interviews Kurtz himself did during the height of the backlash against the prequels. From Skywalking by Dale Pollock, George trusted Kurtz to take care of the questions that distract the director, and Kurtz was happy to stay in the background. He did his job, I did my job, and we sort of complemented each other that way, Lucas says, a Kurtz summary of a 12-year relationship. Kurtz also didn't instruct Lucas on how to make the movie. George didn't like people who told him what to do or how to do it. During the production of the first Star Wars, the stress of the tight schedule and limited resources, as well as the general lack of confidence in Lucas's vision on the part of the English crew, caused relations to become strained between Lucas and some important members of his team, including the DP, Gilbert Taylor. Lucas had originally brought Taylor on because he enjoyed the documentary style that Taylor had brought to A Hard Day's Night and Dr. Strangelove, and while Taylor did some amazing and innovative stuff for the in-camera effects on the film, Lucas felt Taylor wasn't providing the style he was asking for. Spielberg recalls, he didn't like the lighting, he didn't like what his cameraman Gil Taylor had done for him, he was really upset. Lucas had wanted Taylor removed from the production as he became more displeased by these problems. He left the final decision up to Kurtz, but Kurtz was too indecisive and timid to actually make that decision. Maybe Gil Taylor should have been fired, but neither Lucas nor Kurtz was willing to do it. Gary disliked confrontations too, and was convinced that if Taylor was let go, the entire crew might walk off the set. These experiences continued to weigh on Lucas as he reassembled his team for Empire. The only question was whether to rehire Gary Kurtz as producer. Lucas had not forgotten the tensions on Star Wars, which he felt were exacerbated by Kurtz's indecisiveness, particularly his handling of Gil Taylor. But Kurtz wanted to produce Empire, and in spite of his own reservations and the advice of those closest to him, Lucas relented. I suspected there would be problems, and I knew I was asking for trouble, Lucas now says, but he felt he owed Kurtz a second chance. I must underscore here that Lucas was going against his own judgment by bringing Kurtz back on. Perhaps the fallout from acquiescing to this informed Lucas's later pattern of staying true to his own instincts. Kurtz proved to be such a fantastic producer on Empire that director Irvin Kershner doesn't even remember having a single meaningful interaction with him. I didn't really work with Gary that much, says Kershner. I worked with the production people mostly, and he was back there working with them, I guess. I didn't think of Gary as an actual part of the production manager team. By all accounts, the production of Empire went off the rails, largely because of Kurtz's mismanagement. Kershner would take far too long to make decisions on set, and Kurtz wasn't willing to speak up enough to keep the production on track. And guess who else thought Kurtz was too much of a yes man? Guess who else thought that the producer didn't say no to the director enough? George Lucas. Lucas was irritated more at Kurtz for not restraining Kershner. That was the producer's job. Kurtz thought it was more important to make Kershner feel comfortable. The director needs to do what he needs to do, that's all, Kurtz says with a shrug. Lucas saw it another way. Gary never said no to anything. You may find it intellectually useful to keep this in mind next time you see this quote from Gary Kurtz claiming that George Lucas didn't surround himself enough with people who would challenge him. Ironic. Things only got back on track after Lucas went to the London set to take charge of filming. He spent about a third of the shooting schedule supervising Kershner, and that's in addition to writing the story and being in charge of both pre-production and post-production. And when reflecting on his experience on the film, Kershner said that George was the best producer he ever worked with. Kershner had no such praise to offer for Gary Kurtz.
I mean, hell, it's even mentioned in an interview J.W. Rinsler did back in 2010, whilst promoting his book for the making of Empire Strikes Back, there's mention of an actual press release from the pre-Disney era of Lucasfilm during the lead-up to the release of Rinsler's Making of Empire Strikes Back book to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the film, where it outright calls out Gary Kurtz for his lies, saying that the infamous interview that he gave was full of inaccuracies and that Jonathan's book tells the real story about what happened on the production of Empire Strikes Back. Like, wow, this should have been all over the media, but it wasn't. Hardly at all. It hardly got any attention whatsoever, because 2010 wasn't just the 30th anniversary of Empire Strikes Back, it was in fact the year that this vomit-gasm of a documentary was released, at a time when the media's agenda against George Lucas was close to reaching its peak, and thus they had no interest in the truth, because they were too busy with their smear campaign, because they were out for blood.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped.
And this isn't the only instance of the media consciously ignoring evidence to the contrary of their fucking agenda when this information was made public, and only decided to acknowledge it much later when they would inevitably flip-flop and try to spin a new narrative. Anyway, back on point, I think it's extremely telling how George Lucas could have so easily just completely buried both Kirshner and Kurtz in the Empire of Dreams documentary for their incompetence, and almost sending the entire movie as well as the franchise off a cliff, which, considering the amount of stress they caused him, he had every right but simply chose not to. And especially since they, in both the Empire of Dreams documentary and other instances as well, have been less than forthcoming about the actual events that transpired during the making of the original trilogy. And unlike Lucas, it wasn't in the interest of protecting anyone other than themselves. But if anything, I think it's a testament to how gracious a collaborator George Lucas is, that he doesn't like to throw people under the bus, and also the fact that despite getting way more involved with Empire Strikes Back than George Lucas initially intended to, being on set for most of the production, and rewriting Lee Brackett's entire screenplay draft, as well as approving the final version of the screenplay, that he's still happy to remove his name and give sole credit to his collaborators that fulfilled those roles, when he could have easily attached his name for shared directors, screenplay, and editorial credits as well. But I digress. Back to the scene in question, Kirshner in this instance simply pondered what would be best for the scene, and that Han Solo saying, quote, "I'll be back" might somewhat diminish the tension for the emotional climax if Han was reassuring Leia as well as the audience, instead of resigning himself to his potential demise, which ultimately ended up being the right call, and Lucas agreed. And people seem to be under the impression that, oh, thank God Lucas wasn't on set because he never would have allowed his actors to improvise, which first off is a common misconception and or deliberately propagated piece of bullshit.
Is there any truth to that? That's complete bullshit.
Lucas was on set constantly and way more than he initially intended after the Norway shoot was an absolute disaster without him. And secondly, when it comes to improvisation, these same disingenuous douchebags pretend as if George didn't allow exactly that during the filming of A New Hope. Several of those takes in the final cut possess moments of improvisation, or moments that simply were not planned in the shooting script.
And by the time it got to you, was that already the Kasdan draft of it?
It must have been. They didn't involve us until we were necessary. They don't want a lot of our advice. I mean, like I say, I have so many ideas, and I'm more than willing to share them, even terrible ideas. Everybody's working in the same way. I mean, we're all share the idea that we want to make the best possible movie we can. I mean, they were open to listening to what you would say, and sometimes it did influence them a bit. I remember Harrison saying to me, because he came up with some just great ad-libs. There's only one cockpit. He's up on the rostrum, and I'm sitting behind the rostrum in a folding chair waiting for my turn, giving him off-camera lines. So, I got him. He goes, "Great kid." And he added. I thought, are you kidding me? I just loved it. I admired him so much with that. And he said, well, you should learn, Mark. He said, don't go ask George, "Hey, George, can I say this?" Just do it on camera. One morning, he was trying to memorize. It'll take a few moments for the Navicomputer to calculate the coordinates. It'll take a few moments for the Navicomputer to calculate the coordinates.
Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the Navicomputer.
He was just doing this over and over and over. And of course, when push came to shove with squibs going off and them rocking the cockpit, he mangles the line, but in such a Han Solo way that that's the one that you remember.
George Lucas is becoming known as a phenomenon now as a result of the success of Star Wars and, of course, American Graffiti, but you have to have a couple of that kind of successes before you become a phenomenon, I guess.
Yeah.
Does he create the kind of atmosphere with those of you who have worked with him more than once that is conducive?
There's a real supportive atmosphere around George. He's not so much involved in, well, his scripts are very clear, at least they are to me. I mean, you know what part you play in the whole piece from reading the script. He creates characters that have a real clear line to them. Mm-hmm. It's not as if you have to bring in a lot of things, but your ideas are he's very accepting of ideas and suggestions, and he likes to work in an atmosphere where everybody is participating.
Now, just to give you a little bit of extra added insight into how the cast felt with working with the dialogue on the set of Star Wars A New Hope, how they felt about making changes, how much input they were allowed to have on making changes to certain lines, and also what it was like for them to work with George Lucas as a director, I'm going to read you this small excerpt from J.W. Rinzler's book, The Making of Star Wars, that possesses transcripts of on-set interviews from the cast themselves. As their scenes together multiplied, Fisher and Hamill were finding a rapport, as were Hamill and Ford. Played as written, they were supposed to simply exit the elevator into the prison area. The day of shooting, however, they ad-libbed facing the wrong direction when the door opened to add a comic touch. A few days before, they'd improvised with Peter Mayhew as they marched down a Death Star corridor. Chewbacca growled at a mouse droid, which was radio-controlled, did an abrupt about-face, and scurried in the opposite direction. In short, the actors were creating all-important chemistry that Lucas had hoped they would. One point that seems to have drawn them all together was Ford's Kabbalistic handling of his dialogue. Quote, "I had already been shooting for 4 weeks, going on 5, when Harrison came in," Hamill says. Quote, "He visited the set once, and then I went over to his hotel room. We were going to go out and have dinner, and I'm flipping through his copy of the script, and I'd see lines of his just crossed out completely. He'd written things in the margins saying the same thing basically, but his way. He had an amazing way of keeping the meaning, but doing it in a really unique way for his character. Well, the script was the Bible for me. There were lines I just couldn't say, but I learned to say them. It might have even helped my character in a way, that sort of stilted dialogue, but I also kind of kicked myself and wished that I had been loose enough to do what Harrison was doing." Then the interview goes to Carrie Fisher. Quote, "I used to go over lines with Harrison and Mark," Fisher says. Quote, "Harrison would always change his lines. I was very impressed that he could do that. I didn't know what to do with them. They seemed fine like they were. I was also being agreeable because I kept thinking they were going to realize their mistakes soon about hiring me." End quote. And then the interview goes to Harrison Ford. Quote, "Mark makes this big point about my changing dialogue," Ford says. Quote, "But I don't remember really changing that much. I would change the phrase slightly or put a line or a group of lines in a different place, but I would usually discuss those with the script girl rather than George." End quote. Nevertheless, Hamill seized upon the prison level scene as an opportunity for some of his own line changes. Quote, "When we were bringing in the Wookiee, the guard Malcolm Tierney asks, 'Where are you going with this thing?' Hamill says. Quote, and the line was something like, 'It's a prisoner, transfer from cell block,' and then there's lots of letters and numbers. But I love in-jokes. So I said, quote, 'This is a prisoner from 1138. But George came over and said, don't do that. But we did 4 more takes, and by the end I was doing it again. I think I did it on the one he printed. He did." And then the interview goes to Lucas. Quote, "Working with actors is like working with any professional," Lucas says. Quote, "All you have to do is explain what you want and help them try to get it. It's communication more than anything else. There are a lot of theories, but ultimately, at the practical level, it's just a matter of getting across what you want the character to do. If the part is cast properly, and you have a really good actor, he can do it.
George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah. I cast a film, first of all, trying to get the best actors possible. Second of all, given that criteria, I look for people who kind of, in their own personality and their own physical presence, embody what I envision the character to be. So I'm looking for actors who, in their lives and what they are, have some kind of resonance with the character.
In terms of changing their lines, well, that's a matter of letting them have their way. Lots of times, actors have very good instincts. They're thinking about the character a lot more than you are. You're looking at the whole thing. They're looking at only that particular person. If they're uncomfortable or something doesn't work, it's usually because there is something wrong with it. Quote, if I have a disagreement about something with an actor, I'll do it both ways. He adds, quote, I'll spend the time and money on the set to let him have what he wants, but that's just a matter of give and take.
And so we shot.
You shot one like that, right?
Well, we shot one, just for protection, where I spoke the line as written. And George, I think that this is fair enough to say, he went apeshit. He thought it was horrible and that it would get a bad laugh. So I was obliged to sit next to him when he tested it for the first screening. There was a laugh, but it was a laugh of recognition. And so he generously let it.
Well, that says a lot, too, that somebody could recognize that and see that. And
there are some crazy actors in the world, obviously, but the best thing to do is avoid them. I only want people who are good, talented, and easy to work with, because life is too short for crazy actors. The interview then goes back to Mark Hamill. Quote, you like George so much as a person and feel so at ease with him as a friend that you want to please him. Hamill says, quote, he would never embarrass you or make you feel foolish for trying some things, and I tried some really amazing things that were really wrong thinking back on them. I did have a couple of disagreements with him, not big ones where he'd say, well, I don't think he should do it that way. And if George thinks you are wrong, there is no way you can convince him that you are right. He might be open to 100,000 ways of doing something, but if you pick the one that he thinks is wrong, there is no way to show him that you are right. End quote. Granted, that quote from Hamill took place several years before the Carbonite scene, filming the scene as written and then filming Ford's rewrite version of the moment, and Ford opting to sit with Lucas during a test screening with full confidence that his rewrite of the scene was the way to go, that ultimately ended up changing George's mind. But if that doesn't tell you all you need to know about what a give-and-take director Lucas is when it comes to allowing actors freedom on the set, but ultimately putting his foot down and having the final say on everything that makes it into the final cut, and not to mention the excerpt from that Charles Lippincott interview that I mentioned earlier about George Lucas's improvisational approach to directing actors in his movies, like this whole notion that George is a dictator that doesn't allow for improvisation and that forces a soul-sucking robotic performance out of his actors is absolute horseshit.
Is there any truth to that? That's complete bullshit. Right.
So going back to Empire Strikes Back, any improvisational improvements that were made would have almost 100% also been made if George had been present on set during the rare exceptions that he wasn't, like the Carbonite scene, where he just as easily would have collaborated with Ford, who would have had his input, explained his rationale, and Lucas filming and testing two versions of the scene, which just as likely would have produced the same result.
Search your feelings, you know it to be true.
But back to the Han and Leia scene. As for the change itself,
I love you.
I know.
Now, while the line is certainly good and even adheres to that less is more style of dialogue that we discussed earlier as being among one of several of George Lucas's stylistic intentions for Star Wars, but the big reason so many people have shamelessly fondled this particular line as one of the greatest lines in cinema history is because it was one of the very few lines that George Lucas didn't write for the script. Personally, and no disrespect to Empire Strikes Back, but I always thought the line was incredibly overrated. I'm not denying it works, but it wasn't exactly revolutionary, nor did it carry any plot significance with it either. However, what's fucking bizarre is how much stock people like to put into it because of how they like to use it for their own anti-George Lucas dialogue agenda. Same as the whole Lawrence Kasdan apparently wrote Empire Strikes Back narrative, supposedly without George Lucas's involvement. But there's two glaring contradictions to this. Firstly, yes, while Lawrence Kasdan is the credited screenplay writer for Empire Strikes Back, the biggest changes to the script went through and were done by George Lucas himself. Lee Brackett was initially tasked to write the script, but Lucas basically rewrote the entirety of her draft after Brackett passed away in 1978. George just kept her as co-screenplay credit for Empire Strikes Back simply as a courtesy. The script was then passed on to Lawrence Kasdan, who made some contributions doing a dialogue polish for the Yoda scenes, before the script was handed back to Lucas for the finishing touches and the final approval. And it was much the same case, if not more so, for Return of the Jedi. Not to mention, according to J.W. Rinsler himself, who has been quoted saying, unlike Raiders of the Lost Ark, George Lucas was the one who actually wrote the bulk of what's in the final script for Empire Strikes Back.
That's I liked it how you put it in your stream that you did a couple of weeks ago, that, yeah, all the collaborators contributed things. He had amazing collaborators, but you know, the what held the movies together was that it all went through Lucas, right? You know, that he would be the arbiter.
Yeah, Marsha Lucas wasn't working with John Barry. She wasn't working with Ralph. I mean, you know, she wasn't on set with Kirshner. I mean, George is the one who's on it from A to Z. And as he used to say, you know, answering 1,000 questions a day when they're filming. That's or whatever it is, a huge number of questions, all of which are, if you get, you know, more than whatever percent of them wrong, your movie starts falling apart. And so he has to have full credit. And I think one of the things that I was interested to discover in writing about episode 5 and 6 was that, you know, George really wrote the scripts. He wrote the story. Lawrence Kasdan was important, but so was the Hikes on Star Wars. They came in, they polished it. They made some characters better. Like George said that Larry Kasdan really helped the Yoda character, and I think the Emperor. But George is the one who did the heaviest lifting of creating the basic structure and storyline, and for most of the scenes in the scripts as well. And so it's not fair to him to say that he shouldn't get credit for all 6 films.
That's something I refer people to your books on Empire and Return of the Jedi, and that I really love in those books is you have like transcripts of the story transcript meetings, and you have all the different drafts of the screenplay. So you can really, you know, if there's debate, you can really look and see like, okay, this came from Lucas, that came from Kasdan. And that I thought was really, really, I haven't seen any other book that breaks it down in that amount of detail.
Well, and I was able to, because George kept so much stuff and other people came up with certain things. And so I was able to piece it together. And incidentally, the opposite is in a sense true for Raiders of the Lost Ark, where really that's Larry Kasdan's script. George and Spielberg came up with certain ideas. Probably George came up with more ideas during the script story conference. Without a doubt, that seems to be the case. But Kasdan went off and wrote the script. There was no script, whereas that wasn't the case for Empire and Jedi.
Once again, for a more definitive deep dive on the development for the script of Empire Strikes Back, I direct your attention to these excerpts from Rinsler's book, The Making of Empire Strikes Back. There's still plenty more to discuss, so I'll keep this as brief as I can, whilst also providing the necessary context to outline what exactly happened with the development of the script for Star Wars Episode 5. This first excerpt is regarding Lee Brackett's original misfired draft for the film's script. And before I start this off, let me be completely fair and say that Brackett's draft was based off a 9-page story treatment for Empire Strikes Back, which she discussed with Lucas in a story meeting that still possessed a lot of vague ideas and concepts. And in case it wasn't obvious, all first drafts, when it comes to writing, are far from what the finished version is going to look like. Hell, look no further than the earlier script concepts for Star Wars A New Hope. So this isn't me shitting on Brackett by any means, who by all accounts was a terrific writer. She just simply didn't deliver what George had envisioned for the story. Anyway, it reads as follows. On February 25th at 3 p.m, Lucas, Kirshner, and Macquarie met at the Beverly Hills Hotel to go over the film's concept art. The executive producer and director also discussed the script. Both of them were concerned that Brackett's draft did not have the right feeling for a Star Wars movie. That same month, Lucas had signed up another writer, Lawrence Kasdan, to transform his Raiders of the Lost Ark treatment into a script for Steven Spielberg to direct. It then quotes Kasdan. Lee had written something that was of a different era, Kasdan says. She hadn't quite gotten what it is about George. All the ways in which Star Wars revolutionized these kinds of movies. I don't think Lee was quite up to speed with that. I think she was just in an entirely different mode. And it may be a perfectly valid one, but not in the George mode. And he wanted something that would fall in line with Star Wars, that had the same sound, and yet deepened the story. There were many things that didn't quite work when I first saw the script, Kirshner says. Quote, the ending didn't work, there were sequences in the snow that really didn't work. It then quotes Lucas. The truth of it is, I got captivated by the thing. It's in me now, Lucas says, and I can't help but get upset or excited when something isn't the way it's supposed to be. I can see that world. I know the way the characters live and breathe. In a way, they have taken over. It's the hardest thing in writing to be able to develop individual characters that aren't a reflection of the mind that created them. My thoughts during the story conference weren't fully formed, and I felt her script went off in a completely different direction. End quote. Although Brackett's script was faithful to Lucas's treatment in almost all superficial respects, the dialogue and actions of the personnel seemed to belong in another movie, particularly those of Darth Vader. Lucas started by making detailed edits on the first 40 pages of the first draft, having Solo say, quote, there isn't enough life on this ice cube to fill a small space cruiser. He also transforms the ice castle of the rebels into ice caves. He names a character Baron Rabat, and he writes new words for Solo. Quote, I wish you'd never found out about him. To which Leia replies, he's your father. And Han responds, quote, not really, he never adopted me. End quote. Lucas notes that Luke is hanging, quote, upside down in the, quote, snowman cave, and that during the Battle of Hoth, a, quote, force field protects base from above attack, end quote. When Luke meets Minch, another edit reads, quote, intro, more Buddha-like. It then quotes the character, so you've come at last, end quote. However, about halfway into the script that was so far from what he'd wanted, his detailed comments are often replaced by a simple no scrawled next to whole scenes. It then quotes Kasdan, who says, Lucas called her up to talk about it, but she was in hospital, Kasdan says. Lucas would then go on to write the second draft of the script for Empire Strikes Back after Brackett's passing. Now, in regards to the second draft, I'm choosing to gloss over that just for the moment, but we will come back to it. However, what's important to note, just as Rinsler said in that interview clip I showed earlier, Lucas wrote the script and the story for Empire Strikes Back. Period. The second draft, Lucas's second draft, is basically what would end up being the detailed outline of the story, set pieces, and dialogue for Empire Strikes Back, and all the tweaks and changes that were made leading up to the shooting script, which were incredibly minimal when it came to the story, bear in mind, were done so making reference to this script, which was written by Lucas, which, similarly to the third draft of Star Wars, that I've referenced for numerous examples of certain individuals loving to, in very bad faith, use as a means of discrediting George Lucas's script writing and more specifically his dialogue writing ability. Just like the third draft for Star Wars, the second draft for Empire Strikes Back and its dialogue is also very unpolished and essentially acts as a new first draft, really, which Lucas never intended to be in the finished film and simply wanted it to act as an incredibly detailed guide for Brackett's replacement to polish into something he would edit, approve, and be happy with for the final shooting script. This next excerpt from Rinsler's book comes from the script conference attended by Lucas, Kirshner, and Kasdan several months later after George had finished the second draft script for Empire Strikes Back, and it reads as follows. Following his short vacation, either in late June or early July, Kasdan met with Lucas and Kirshner for a multi-day script conference. Kasdan was given only Lucas's draft from which to work. Quote, "We discarded Lee's script, which never got treated as the basis for anything," Kasdan says. Quote, "The writing part is always the hardest part of filmmaking. Almost anyone can direct. They won't necessarily direct well, but the machinery works. You can take someone off the street and put them with an experienced crew, and the movie will get made. The writing can't be faked. It doesn't run itself. It has to be worked out very specifically, word for word, image for image. We'd sit around and go through it page by page. The three of us," Lucas says. Quote, "Kirsch would say, I suggest it should be like this. And I'd sometimes say, no, this is why it is like this." Again, Lucas putting his foot down where he needs to because he knows better for what works in his story, in his fucking universe. Anyway, the excerpt goes on. Quote, "The first script meetings were fantastic," Kasdan says. "They were designed to get me into the whole Star Wars mode. There's a certain kind of talk. There are certain conventions. There are some things you just don't talk about, certain units of measurement and any and all references to the planet Earth. You have to cleanse all that from your mind." Right there, Kasdan's just mentioning yet another aspect of the very specifically tailored style of Star Wars dialogue. So for the people saying, this isn't how real people talk, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. This isn't the real fucking world. Kasdan goes on, "What's possible? What can a person do? What can another type of creature do? There's no question that on Empire, George knows what it should be. He has the larger saga in mind at all times. And he knew which way things were going. Kirshner and I, neither of us knew." It then quotes Lucas. "Working with Kirsch and Larry, I had two advantages in that situation," Lucas says. Quote, "One being the executive producer, the other, I know the world and I know the story. And I knew what the third movie was going to be. So there was a lot of, no, I need that for the next movie, or this is what the Force can do and can't do. And this is how it operates and everything. So I'm the encyclopedia. If they wanted to change anything, first I would have to run it through the encyclopedia and say, okay, that works, but then I'd have to run it through the story. This is where things are going, and this is where they've been. They were stuck with the fact that I had a vast amount of information, some of which they didn't have and wasn't really relevant to this particular story." It then goes back to Kasdan. Quote, "George, Kirsch and I talked about every line in it," says Kasdan. "We talked about what this script was really supposed to be and what was missing. A lot of the dialogue was wrong. It was put there to convey the idea of action to us. It wasn't meant to be a finished script." End quote. Now, the script for Empire Strikes Back would go through 3 more drafts by Kasdan, each of which would be assessed by Lucas in the same way that he assessed Lee Brackett's draft. Though, as I've previously mentioned, and is stated by both Lucas and Kasdan, the big difference with Lucas's edits to Kasdan's drafts is that Brackett's draft, which was merely working from a story treatment and Lucas's vague ideas and concepts, wasn't used as the basis for any of it. Kasdan's polishes to the script were based on both Lucas's story and his fully completed second draft script, which according to Rinsler, gave the film its definitive form. But in Kasdan's case, unlike Brackett, the bulk of the work was already done. Whatever contributions Kasdan did that was kept in the final cut was basically done so on training wheels. Whereas Lucas's scripts for both Empire Strikes Back and especially New Hope were done so entirely from scratch and was a far more arduous task. And as I said, I'll come back to Lucas's second draft screenplay for Empire Strikes Back in an upcoming section for this video. But all that was just the first reason for why the script and story in The Empire Strikes Back wasn't the genius of Lawrence Kasdan as so many people like to propagate. And if that wasn't enough to prove that Lucas's supposed lack of involvement with the original trilogy has been a myth propagated by the internet from the get-go, the second example should be quite obvious for Episode 5's dialogue being as iconic as it was. Because the line that Empire Strikes Back is most known for, and the line which Empire Strikes Back is certainly far more renowned for having than Harrison Ford's improvised "I know," and is also one of the most widely quoted and cherished lines of all time, is
"No, I am your father."
And we know for a fact this is George Lucas's line because Kershner, Hamill, and himself were the only ones who knew about it. The shooting script for The Empire Strikes Back had phony dialogue for Vader's confrontation with Luke, remember? So Lawrence Kasdan had butt-fuck nothing to do with it. However, as I've already pointed out, it's not just this certain collective of fans propagating this nonsense, but even some of George's own collaborators who worked with him on the Childhood trilogy have also taken part in propagating a very misleading telling of events to make themselves look better for the history books. Personally, I think this stems from these particular individuals getting extremely defensive about their own contributions to the original trilogy because of how successful it was. Whether it's just simple embellishment or straight up lying about stories in order to exaggerate how much they actually contributed to the aspects of the original trilogy that are almost unanimously praised to this very day. I discussed Kershner at length, and Gary Kurtz is certainly another who has taken part in this, but one of the most egregious examples I've found of this happening comes from Lawrence Kasdan, who has been far more dishonest about the events that transpired during the making of The Empire Strikes Back, particularly in more recent interviews. This particular instance I'm talking about took place while Kasdan was promoting The Force Awakens in 2015, which he co-wrote with the guy that this collective of clowns said should have been the one to helm the prequel trilogy, as well as the Disney trilogy.
We have a director who actually understands this world and who understands the idea of creating practical events, not just a whole bunch of CGI, who really understands fast-paced filmmaking, who was more inspired by Star Wars as a child than Star Trek, and he made 2 really good Star Trek movies, in my opinion. So I'm looking forward to his view of the new Star Wars films.
You see, in my opinion, where the prequels utterly failed, Star Trek excelled.
Nevertheless, what I am is optimistic, because I am an optimist, and I'm excited for a great movie, and I'm truly hoping we're going to get another Star Wars trilogy for the history books, and it's looking like it has the great possibility of being that way because we have people behind and in front of the camera who care. And who are talented and are good at what they do and understand the fan perspective now, especially after the prequels, because something that the prequels did not have is the prequels already existing. Now that we have the prequels existing, they're like, we know what not to do. Let's not do that again. Let's do something else and make it the way it should be.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? That's what it's always been about.
Use practical effects, makeup, creatures, real awesome stunt work, have real places, not just a giant green screen environment in which you're told to do it faster and with more intensity over and over again. Never mind, okay, I'm getting on a tangent here, and let's just be optimistic about Star Wars Episode 7. The original cast is in it, oh my god.
In fact, J.J. Abrams should have directed the prequels, and George Lucas should have directed people to their seats in the theater.
Wow.
And again, given that this was 2015 and took place at the height of the online hatred against George Lucas by both fans and especially the media, they saw this as a feeding frenzy to further discredit the man. Particularly this article from Wired magazine, who I'll have plenty to say about later on, and written by a self-proclaimed Empire Strikes Back fanboy interviewing Kasdan and fawning over him. Hell, the dog slop title of the article should be indicative of that. This interviewer asks Kasdan, "How did you get involved with Star Wars?" To which Kasdan responds with, "My initial engagement with it was kind of a surprise. I had just taken 6 months to write Raiders of the Lost Ark from scratch. I handed it in, and George said, 'Do you want to write Empire Strikes Back?' Literally. He threw it on the desk and asked me to write Empire. He said, quote, 'We are in big trouble. Lee Brackett, who wrote the first draft, has passed away. They're building sets in England, and I don't have a script.'"
That's complete bullshit.
Right. Kasdan replied with, quote, "Maybe you ought to read Raiders first." And George said, quote, "I'm going to read it tonight, and if I don't like it, I'll call you back and take back this offer." End quote. Kasdan goes on, This was a complete detour for me to now find myself working with George on Star Wars. It was very exciting, and since it was so fast, the pressure was so great, there's nothing more exhilarating. He used his own money to make Empire. That's unheard of. You would think he'd thought of it all along, and maybe he had, but there was no reality to Empire when he was making A New Hope. Now the whole world opens up to him, and he can tell the big story. And he enlisted me to help tell it. He had the story, I went off with director Irvin Kershner and wrote it in 6 weeks.
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
Doesn't that sound strange, given all we've discussed? Though I suppose some of you might interpret Kasdan's account here as simply discussing his work on Empire's script leading up to the first story conference with Kershner and Lucas after Empire's second draft had already been completed, or that Lawrence Kasdan just simply forgot the order of events that took place.
You serious?
I don't buy that for a single solitary second. You don't just forget about the entire second draft of the script that was handed to you, with most of the broader story concepts and scenes already in place as well as the dialogue. Kasdan outright omitted the fact that George Lucas already had a script for Empire Strikes Back that he gave to Kasdan to help him work on. And Kasdan even outright says that he and Kershner went off and wrote the script without George, and he even takes credit for the 6 weeks it took Lucas to finish the second draft in a timely manner. Yeah, there's your hero, scumbags. Including this fuckwit fanboy journalist douchebag. And hell, if you want some greater insight into the quote-unquote true genius behind the script of The Empire Strikes Back and how he works, well, the interview goes on and Kasdan discusses what it was like working with J.J. Abrams on the script for The Force Awakens. The interviewer asks, what was it like working with Abrams on the script? Kasdan's response, what we wanted from the movie was exactly the same. To return it to a kind of physicality, tangible, real sets, real features. Kind of lightly funky, even though it's incredibly sophisticated.
Sophisticated?
The feeling we wanted was from the first trilogy, which was, it's fun, it's delightful, it moves like a son of a bitch, and you don't question too much. It's no secret that the Disney trilogy was made in direct response to the online backlash levied at George Lucas and the quote-unquote criticisms of the prequels by certain internet and journalist personalities.
Because we have people behind and in front of the camera who care and who are talented and are good at what they do and understand the fan perspective now, especially after the prequels. Because something that the prequels did not have is the prequels already existing. Now that we have the prequels existing, they're like, we know what not to do. Let's not do that again. Let's do something else and make it the way it should be. Use practical effects, makeup, creatures, real awesome stunt work. Have real places, not just a giant green screen environment in which you're told to do it faster and with more intensity over and over again.
You see, in my opinion, where the prequels utterly failed, Star Trek excelled. Star Trek is really engaging. It's fun, adventurous, fast-paced. Heroes are heroes and villains are villains. And at the very least, you know what's happening. It's everything we did not get in the prequels. In fact, J.J. Abrams should have directed the prequels, and George Lucas should have directed people to their seats in the theater.
But seeing Kasdan basically outright say it in this interview is just wild. Maybe don't listen to idiots the next time you get the chance to make a Star Wars trilogy. Not that there will be a next time. Seriously, is it any wonder at this point why those movies went down in fucking flames? But before we move on, I want to go back to this interviewer who wrote this article to give you an idea of what kind of sycophant he is. since he updated the article correcting his assertion that Kasdan came up with Han Solo's "I know" line when called out by his own audience, and then this slimy scumbag tries to douse the flames by saying he was as wrong as inserting Jabba the Hutt into A New Hope. And he goes on to be sarcastic about Greedo shooting first to try and calm the mob because it was 2015 and we hate George Lucas, right guys? Doesn't everyone hate George Lucas?
Shut the fuck up.
Bit of a detour, I know, but I figured it was appropriate given the fact that this video is basically dedicated to shitting on the media and influencers alike for the incredibly dumb shit they tend to spout about Star Wars and have done so for decades. As for the directing on Empire Strikes Back, and I've briefly mentioned this earlier, but some people tend to cling to Irvin Kershner as the big difference maker in terms of why Empire Strikes Back is, from their point of view anyway, just completely head and shoulders above the rest of the Star Wars saga due to his magic touch as a director. Now, Kershner certainly had a style of his own that naturally was allowed to somewhat breathe during principal photography. But much like Lawrence Kasdan's work on the script, it was done so on training wheels when compared to the arduous tasks that Lucas had. The trail had already been blazed, the guidelines had been set, and Kershner would be supervised by Lucas, who would be ready to course correct if Kershner strayed too far from what he wanted, and the Star Wars style that was established. Ever since 1977, Lucas has made his intentions and his style crystal clear for what Star Wars is, and how it was meant to be portrayed, regarding the acting and the writing. And he's kept that style consistent throughout each of the Star Wars films. The only thing that's really changed is the story. Empire Strikes Back was intentionally a much darker story than Star Wars was, and Return of the Jedi, at least for the most part, was a much lighter story than Empire Strikes Back.
Well, why don't you use your divine influence and get us out of this?
So claiming that Empire Strikes Back didn't possess the more theatrical 1930s dialogue and acting is asinine. You don't have to look very far as to where certain shots and sequences in Empire Strikes Back were drawing their inspirations from. Lucas was on set looking over the shoulder of both of his directors almost the entire time, especially when Gary Kurtz and Irvin Kershner almost sunk the franchise and took way too long and went way over budget with the scenes they were tasked to shoot in Norway. But the fact of the matter is, these same people propagating these myths about Lucas loved the style, fell in love with the style, and did so while Lucas was directing all the way back in the original Star Wars film. They just like to come up with all these ridiculous notions as to why that is, in a sheer pathetic attempt to discredit George Lucas out of personal spite. Now, in regards to the directing on the original Star Wars, one thing I briefly wanted to mention is how people often like to regurgitate quotes from the original cast about how George came off as though he lacked patience for the acting process during principal photography.
Faster and more intense, that was his main direction. He just wanted us to speed through it.
George is notorious for saying, after a take, do it again, faster, more intensity. He certainly said to me, it's terrific, Tony, can you do it again faster? But that's it, I didn't get more intensity. I don't think 3PO with more intensity would be bearable, do you?
I think George likes people. I think George is a warm-hearted person. But he's a little impatient with the process of acting, of finding something, and he thinks it's there. It's right there. I wrote it down, Just do that. Sometimes you can't just do that and make it work.
And certain disingenuous Star Wars fans especially love repeating this when they try to suggest that Irvin Kershner was the reason for the success of The Empire Strikes Back. Again, the supposed difference maker, so to speak. Now again, without throwing stones at Kershner, mostly, something that's often overlooked by many, including the cast of Star Wars themselves, or outright deliberately ignored by those who wish to maintain their delusions, is the fact that Kershner was basically standing on Lucas's shoulders the entire time and was afforded every luxury that Lucas wasn't back when he was trying to get the original Star Wars film made. While it's true that George Lucas much prefers other avenues of filmmaking rather than just directing, that doesn't mean he doesn't know how to direct or how the actor-director process works. Like he learnt from Francis Ford Coppola, for God's sake.
You sort of realize that these would be good allies. So what you're going to do is make them allies. So you're just going to sort of play along and wait until your moment, and then you're going to...
It's very telling that I let them take my weapons. There's a moment there where I could either strike out or you could kill them all.
Well, you got a sense of the future. You got a sense of the fact that it's these little funny teddy bears that could destroy the Empire.
And like all directors, George Lucas certainly has a style that works for him, as we've discussed ad nauseum by this point. But if we were to briefly compare the productions of both A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, starting with the fact that Star Wars A New Hope had a much shorter shooting schedule that lasted from mid-March 1976 to early July 1976, and principal photography still managed to run 2 weeks over schedule.
I think we were like 2 weeks over schedule. At that point, the board of directors at Fox started to panic and tell Alan Ladd Jr. that he had to shut that film down regardless. And so he came to me and said, look, you've got to finish in the next week because I got another board meeting and I can't go in there and say we're still shooting.
Faster and more intense, that was his main direction. He just wanted us to speed through it.
The final scenes were filmed at breakneck speed, with Lucas frantically bicycling from one soundstage to another.
Well, I think George suffered a lot more than I was aware of at the time, but I was very focused on what I was doing because this was a very busy movie. It was just non-stop, dawn to dusk. We did go over at the end, and we split into 3 units right at the end, and Gary directed the 2nd unit, and I had the distinction of directing the 3rd unit of Star Wars. My shots were things like close-up of R2-D2's 3rd foot going down. Nothing too dramatic, but that's how we finished it.
Mind you, this was for a project that basically no one outside of George Lucas understood and basically ran entirely on faith that he knew what he was doing. And is clearly evident by the success of the movie, he absolutely did.
I know, right?
In other words, George Lucas wasn't rushing the directing process because he didn't care or lacked respect for it. By the end of the shooting schedule, he was rushing it because he had to meet the fucking deadline or the movie would have been finished and he would have been broke. Now, when it comes to Empire Strikes Back, while it's arguable that film had the more challenging shoot, as I said, and it's well documented, that Empire Strikes Back also possessed many of the luxuries that George Lucas didn't have on the original film. Perhaps most importantly, the fact that Star Wars 1977 had set a precedent for success and an outrageous space fantasy story that somehow managed to work and captivate millions. In other words, Star Wars A New Hope set a blueprint that the hired director for Empire Strikes Back could follow and be facilitated by the original director / creator, who was now the executive producer, and who could handhold the new director and provide everything they needed, including a higher budget paid from the creator's own pocket, as well as a far more generous shooting schedule to finish the film. Kirshner also put a strain on the production because he was overly indulging the actors and constantly changing his mind at the last minute. In the years since, Kirshner constantly receives praise for his directing in Empire Strikes Back from just about everyone, including George Lucas himself, and is often noted by the cast as the quote-unquote actor's director, which again is regurgitated by certain fans like it's some sort of slap in the face at George Lucas. But Kirshner was allowed to be the quote-unquote actor's director and take his time because George Lucas facilitated it. George gave him far more resources, a completely finished and polished script to work with pre-existing characters and a pre-existing story, as well as everything else in between, and again, a much longer shooting schedule. George Lucas couldn't indulge the actors as much because he was running behind on Star Wars and went 2 weeks over schedule. Kirshner was allowed a much more generous time frame to shoot Empire Strikes Back. Unlike Star Wars A New Hope, the shooting for Empire Strikes Back started in early March and ended in late September, and it still managed to go at least 50 days over schedule. Yeah, I guess it's much easier to be careless when it's someone else's money on the line, and sure, the rest is history, and Empire Strikes Back, after some post-production tinkering by George Lucas, just for the record, became a classic, but it wasn't a case of Kirshner taking longer than normal to create magic, due to his exquisite genius. It was Kershner and Gary Kurtz being completely careless, and George Lucas having to somehow pick up the pieces for their mess in order to somehow get the film finished. And that's how Empire Strikes Back managed to succeed. And is also one of the reasons why George Lucas may have lacked a certain patience at times for the acting process when he was trying to make the original film. That being said, there's an excerpt from Rinzler's Making of Empire Strikes Back book where Hamill outlines that Kershner had made Empire into his own film, by which Hamill likely means that Kershner took certain creative liberties with the shoot that George would not have necessarily taken himself, which is absolutely fine, that's to be expected. That being said, I'd find it hard to imagine, however, from Hamill's point of view, that one could hardly call this Kershner's film when he didn't write the script, write the story, create the characters, or the universe. He didn't edit the film together, he didn't oversee post-production or put together the final cut, which, for all of his perfectly valid and creatively sound contributions to the film, he still needed to be supervised by Lucas on set in order to finish the film, and those contributions which he made still needed to be approved by, you guessed it, Lucas himself. Now that being said, George Lucas has always been more than forthcoming about giving his hired director his due, which is both extremely gracious and modest on Lucas's behalf. Such modesty, in fact, which this certain pathetic collective of Star Wars degenerates loves to use as extremely weak ammunition to twist for their own agenda, which you'll soon see as I heavily elaborate on that coming up soon in this video. But going back to the excerpt from Rinzler's book and the contributions made by Kershner, once again, if you compare the productions of both Star Wars A New Hope and Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, it's extremely clear who had the more arduous task. And comparatively speaking here, Kershner's job and his contributions were essentially done on training wheels, and he had no definitive authority over the final cut. However, according to Rinzler's book and Kershner's own account, which I find extremely telling in terms of how much of his own stamp he wanted to force into Empire Strikes Back, during the production as well as in hindsight as well, which I find is also supported by his very misleading recount of the carbonite scene, which is this excerpt where Kershner says, quote, "These are a set of characters that sprang out of George's mind, which are all based on characters that he absorbed from the culture, comics, books, films. They've all been filtered through his mind, but what I'm taking really is raw material. He mined it and I'm decorating it and making, I hope, little jewels. The gold is there, I needed the gold to make the fine jewelry." I'm sorry, but all due respect to Kershner's memory.
Okay, what the fuck?
Kershner says he's taking raw material and turning it into fine jewelry? I don't see how already established characters in an already established universe from an already established script with an already established movie from an already established filmmaker constitutes quote-unquote raw material. I think objectively that should sound like a dream job for any hired director because most of the heaviest lifting is already done. And hell, if nothing else, let's hear from George Lucas himself on what constitutes raw material in terms of making a film.
To me, editing is what filmmaking is really all about, because it's the one time you get a chance to create something out of material and actually deal directly with an audience. All the other times you're sort of generating material or supplies. It's like making a film is like buying lumber or cutting down trees and making wood out of it, where editing is like actually constructing a house. I mean, you actually can see it, you can see what you're doing and deal with it. Everybody says, you know, well, the script doesn't work, but we'll fix it later. And they say, well, we're shooting this, but it isn't really working, but we'll fix it in the editing. Well, the editing is where it's got to be fixed. If it doesn't work there, the movie doesn't work. So that's, to me, the most exciting part.
Yeah, so Kershner's comments saying that he was making fine jewelry from George's raw material is utter crap. Every shot the self-glamorizing old kook overly indulgently delivered was nothing but raw material that needed refining, which would have been nothing without the post-production and editing which was overseen by Lucas himself. And one more thing I'd like to add in terms of how involved George Lucas was in how Empire got made is that in the same excerpt from Rinzler's book, Carrie Fisher goes on to say that Kirshner and Lucas were essentially one body when it came to discussing what worked about the film. And just to drive one last nail into the commonly misused and regurgitated faster and more intense quote that these degenerate sycophants love to use to discredit George Lucas's directing skill.
Faster and more intense. That was his main direction. He just wanted us to speed through it.
Well, according to Carrie Fisher herself, earlier in that same excerpt from Rinzler's book, she admits Kirshner directed them as actors more than George Lucas did, as part of his own style, I'm sure, but also due to other reasons I've previously explained, including a much more lenient time frame to shoot the movie, as well as much more resources as well. However, Carrie Fisher goes on to say that in Empire Strikes Back, as opposed to Star Wars, in regards to how much direction George Lucas needed to give them for the portrayal of their characters, she says, quote, "In Star Wars, George really didn't have to, because there weren't as many scenes that called for character portrayal," end quote. And now, while I mostly agree with that, I certainly don't think Star Wars A New Hope lacked scenes of character portrayal, but in terms of the directing, she is spot on that George Lucas knew he had everything he needed in order for the actors to portray the characters that he wanted, because much of the heavy lifting was already done in the extremely thorough casting process that Lucas uses as part of his directing style. His very improvisational directing style.
George likes to cast people that are so close to what he wants, he doesn't have to really get in there and give you a lot of direction.
Yeah. But again, that's George with his lateral thinking. I mean, he's just an outlier. Finally, I was teamed with Cindy Williams, who sadly just passed away, and we won the role, but it was our 6th audition over a period of about 6 months. And I asked George about it later, and he said, yeah, it took me that long to find the cars, too. So, again, he was looking at this thing holistically. He was creating a world. We were a part of it. But he didn't want to direct us too much. He wanted us to be very naturalistic. And I told him then that I'd been accepted to USC Film School and that I wanted to be a filmmaker. And he said, oh, great. He said, make sure you study animation, because that's pure filmmaking. Animation is pure filmmaking. And he said, you don't have to worry about the actors and things like that. And I thought, well, this is kind of a crazy thing to say to one of your actors in your one meeting before you're going to go off and shoot the movie. But, George wasn't censoring himself. He was trying to be helpful.
You've said that George never quite figured out how to talk to actors. How so?
George is very result-oriented, and he has something in his head, and he counted on the actors to get it there, but he didn't think of himself as a performance whisperer. And yet you look at the performances in American Graffiti, and they're very, very cutting edge. I mean, they were so honest, and that honesty was just what that movie needed, just as the sort of the faster, more intense direction that he gave everybody over and over again in Star Wars. That was his main direction, faster and more intense. But that was right for Star Wars. So he, I think more than anything, great eye for casting.
But also, and what I think people seem to always miss about the original trilogy actors' assessment of George Lucas as a director, is that they weren't really privy to all of the complications of the production from a business standpoint. They had no grasp of the overall production. They had a very microscopic look into something so grand in scale. They were puzzled as to why George Lucas would tell them to speed up their performances with more intensity, when it turns out not only was it exactly what Star Wars A New Hope benefited from, as far as the acting goes, but also, again, because due to the troubled production, George Lucas had to race to the finish line since he was short on both funding and time.
I think we were like 2 weeks over schedule. At that point, the board of directors at Fox started to panic and tell Alan Ladd Jr. that he had to shut that film down regardless. And so he came to me and said, look, you've got to finish in the next week because I got another board meeting and I can't go in there and say we're still shooting.
The final scenes were filmed at breakneck speed, with Lucas frantically bicycling from one soundstage to another.
The disingenuous douchebags parroting this phrase, saying that George Lucas only had the phrase faster and more intense in terms of his directing to help his actors, are not only deliberately misusing the phrase, but are also disingenuously oversimplifying what the actors are saying. Actors who were only directed by George Lucas, at least primarily, only once, which was on the production of Star Wars A New Hope, which again just so happened to be the Star Wars production, which was also completed under the most duress.
Coincidence? I think not!
These same people also loved using the faster and more intense quote-unquote criticism of George Lucas's directing to discredit his directing abilities on the prequels because they like to pretend there's this big difference in the directing and acting style between the trilogies, but if you actually watch all of the prequel documentary footage, I personally couldn't find one single instance of George Lucas ever saying faster and more intense to his actors. Or hell, even his actors saying that Lucas only gave them the faster and more intense to help them act. Instead, I only found instances of George Lucas directing his actors like this.
And so then you're very strong on that. It's almost said with not a little bit of anger, a tinge of, I will, determination and anger. I will not betray the Republic. My loyalties. So you're turning on, but it's, it's like I will not betray the Republic. That's your rationalization for everything you've done.
Perhaps it was because, unlike Star Wars A New Hope, the only time Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher were directed by George Lucas, again, primarily at least, the prequel trilogy, on the other hand, which they were not present on set for, was shot in a much more generous time frame, with a much higher budget, and George Lucas was actually able to take his time with the actors and their performances. So for those of you who have never directed a day in your life, never went to film school, know nothing about Star Wars or all of the above, who are saying that the quote-unquote faster and more intense aspect of George Lucas's directing was his quote fundamental flaw as a director, and that this was supposedly why the prequels suffered, how in the actual fuck can you possibly make that ridiculous, sad excuse of an argument when the original trilogy film that George Lucas directed was practically bathed in that phrase, allegedly, and the prequels have many behind-the-scenes instances of George Lucas being the kind of quote-unquote actor's director that these scumbags love to champion Kirshner as.
Really makes you think.
So can we all drop this ridiculous notion that George Lucas doesn't know how to direct? You'd have better luck with a flat earth fucking theory. Also, returning to the ridiculous notion that it was the cast and crew that had greater insight into what made these movies work than George Lucas did.
That's a good one.
The one cast member we've yet to discuss on the matter is Carrie Fisher, who, as I'm sure most of us know, was a very outspoken individual. Carrie Fisher, in an interview for The Empire Strikes Back, describes the challenges of working with the Star Wars dialogue, not because it's bad or poorly written, but there's very little to guide the actor in delivering it, because it sounds so strange. Otherworldly even, being in a sci-fi setting with so many strange references and terminologies embedded within the dialogue that she didn't have the faintest clue about, but was specifically tailored to Star Wars.
And in which way acting is difficult in this kind of film?
A lot of times it has nothing to do with acting because it requires your total concentration and your total commitment, but you're given lines sometimes 2 minutes before the scene goes on. Impossible dialogue to say. You can type it, like Harrison says, you can type it fine, there's no way to say it. Certain things that I can't even remember. You'll never get this bucket of bolts past that blockade. Well, it's very early in the morning, it's like saying, Betty bought a bit of butter, those kind of... your mouth refuses to get around those words and make it sound like a sentence that you just off the top of your head and not sound false or, doesn't ring true or anything like that. So we're saddled with a lot of that dialogue, and a lot of times I don't know what the dialogue means. You're given certain dialogue just to accommodate a move across the set. And so you can't justify it, you can't sort of say, wait, stop everything, stop all the explosives and the special effects. Excuse me. Now, when I'm saying this thing about all the troops on Sector 12 to the South Slope, what is Sector 12? Actually, what is Sector 12? I don't know what Sector 12 is. I have to admit it. I just had to say it, and they said they were going to loop something over it. It's like, I guess, doing an Italian film, you know, when they say they have people. We do that. We don't do that a lot on this. But when there's a lot of action, you know that you probably will have to loop the dialogue anyway because there's so much noise. So they just give you things to say, and then they will put other words over it later.
This was the longest speech on the planet Earth. I had no idea what I was talking about. Several ion cannons will fire blasts at the shield of the blah. And then I was in the gobbledygook of George's typewriter. So I am desperately hoping that I can remember this speech. I had no clue as to what I was talking about. Understood? Good luck.
Oh, and by the way, Carrie Fisher was one of the script doctors who did dialogue polishes on the prequels, including, yes, the dialogue for The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. According to sources, including but not limited to Paul Duncan, author of the Star Wars Archives book. Yes, one of George's many supposed yes men was indeed a yes woman, and that yes woman, who not only lived through George's supposed terrible dialogue and knows firsthand just how difficult it can be for an actor to work with it, also had no problem telling George this while he was accepting his Lifetime Achievement Award.
George is a sadist. But like any abused child wearing a metal bikini changed to a giant slug about to die, I keep coming back for more. Not to mention, you had the unmitigated gall to let that chick, the new girl who plays my mother, Queen Amadillo, or whatever her name is, she wears a new hairstyle and outfit practically every time she walks through a door. I mean, I bet she even got to wear a bra, even though you told me I couldn't because there was no underwear in space.
So I'm pretty sure Carrie Fisher, as George's script doctor for the prequels, would have had no problem telling George if she thought the dialogue wasn't up to scratch for a Star Wars film. It's also very clear that the two remained close friends right up until the time of Fisher's passing. But much like Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill for that matter, Carrie's remarks about George's dialogue is just her playing around for fun.
Now, do you remember when I wrote the Young Indiana Jones thing with you?
Mm-hmm.
And we both had these.
Matahari? Yes. That's always the best way to write.
I think
I'd always write these beautiful romantic lines.
No, but
and
that
your
was-
opinion of my
that's what
romantic line is in that little
but we would. I remember that we both took them, and
I would take it away from you.
No, but you had it also. We were both going like that and doing. We both had them, and we were both.
I would grab it away from you and.
Well, the
Send it
thing
back to
is, you wanted to write, and I believe it did end up this way because, you know, you're George Lucas and I'm not, which I only realized this morning, which was upsetting. You wanted to write, your eyes are the colors of diamonds that glow.
Nah, come on, it wasn't that bad.
It was pretty.
Well, it was very flowery. It was very ironic and modern, cynical kind of dialogue. It wasn't hip. It was
very 40s. But I mean, the weirdest 40s in the world.
As a matter of fact, one of the reasons, according to sources, that Carrie Fisher became a scriptwriter in the first place is because she despised one particular line in the original Star Wars script. And what was that line, you may ask?
I have placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the memory systems of this R2 unit. This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
Yes, it turned out to be one of the most iconic monologues in cinema history. Now, out of context, the line looks and sounds ridiculous. The end result, however, makes perfect sense and is widely quoted even today. And that's the point, that the cast didn't hate the lines because they supposedly didn't think much of George. The cast hated the dialogue, initially anyway, because they didn't understand George, as did many others who failed to understand it until the final cut was put together. It's as simple as that.
When you read the script, which I imagine was several years ago now, what was your reaction? Because it is, I'm sure then it must have seemed, to some extent anyway, a pretty bizarre kind of film.
Well, I wanted to know what the lunch breaks were going to be like, you know, when they said cut, and here you were sitting around with three-headed monsters and people with hairdryer heads and so on. But it was a terrific script because they had to budget the film like a low-budget film. They call it the most expensive low-budget film ever made. They had to plan every shot because they were going to have to devise all sorts of new things for the special effects. They only had, and I say only, but for special effects it's not much, $3 million. It's a $10 million film. They devised a whole new method for shooting the special effects, which was computerized. And they would have a memory, and it would just shoot the thing against a blue screen over and over for about a year to perfect all of the things, the blowing up of certain portions of the planets and so forth. It took a long time to do all that.
So they used
models
and shot each individual movement separately.
Yes.
Rather like a cartoon is made in a sense.
Yes.
And before people start trying to reallocate the credit for this iconic line to other people that worked on Star Wars, as is the customary coping mechanism for those Gen X morons who seem to cling to Marshall Lucas saving Star Wars, and Star Wars going downhill after Kirshner and Kurtz nearly bankrupted the fucking thing, and George needing to come in to fucking fix their shit, just for the record. But regarding Princess Leia's message to Obi-Wan, Carrie Fisher has even said that she wasn't able to have input on her dialogue until Return of the Jedi. And that's only due to Harrison Ford, who kept insisting on making tweaks and changes to his own lines, which might sound better for Han Solo in isolation, however would completely stuff up the dialogue exchange for everyone else, because they wouldn't match what he was saying. And these empty-headed morons leap at the opportunity of saying that the very idea that the actors had to quote-unquote fix George's script for him because they tweaked a couple of lines, like, get fucked. Seriously, this collaborative process, which apparently is only a collaborative process when it comes to Star Wars, and not Tarantino, Scorsese, or Ridley Scott movies when put under the same lens, this collaborative process is nothing new when it comes to making movies. In fact, it's commonplace. Star Wars just gets put under this very hyper-fixated lens because a very vocal set of brain-dead degenerates out there, for whatever retarded reason, like to use this lens as some sick, twisted, spiteful, and incredibly disingenuous attempt to discredit George Lucas. But if you widen the lens, it's a perfectly normal practice. Hell, remember Spider-Man? If you look at the shooting script for Spider-Man, you'll see just how many fucking edits and rewrites that thing went through. And then the finished written work for the shoot has dozens upon dozens of tweaks and little changes to the dialogue. Whether it was the actors insisting that the dialogue be tweaked, or the director choosing to cut out certain lines, or in many cases just dubbing new dialogue in post-production.
I'll be here when you get back.
Not coming back, Chief.
Are you in or are you out?
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
Wrong answer! No one says no to me!
This guy, Flash Thompson, he probably deserved what happened. But just because you can beat him up doesn't give you the right to. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Like, Spider-Man is a fantastic script, but the shooting script is not what's in the final cut of the movie. But again, only Star Wars gets put under the lens of an actor made a suggestion to take out one line that apparently would have caved in the whole movie.
Horror.
Like I said, they use this hyper-fixated lens, but again, they don't want to widen the lens, because then all of a sudden their argumentation falls the fuck apart. Another excellent example they like to do this with, besides the dialogue, is this very common reaction to a rough cut screening, which people also try to use to discredit George Lucas, and of course, they have to take it out of context.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Again, I repeat, the director's reaction to the rough cut screening of the movie. Not the final cut screening of the movie, the rough cut screening. as in not the finished fucking thing. And directors, along with their production crew members, reacting negatively to a rough cut screening of a movie is incredibly commonplace. Just like on the original 3 Star Wars films.
The narrative of Rocket Jump's video is extremely simple and is essentially told before the title appears and the video proper even begins. It goes like this. George Lucas made Star Wars and then showed it to his friends. They hated it. The movie was a disaster.
But the film was not beyond saving.
So Lucas hired 3 brilliant editors, Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, and Paul Hirsch, and they saved the film. The end. The first of many problems with this narrative is that this disastrous cut of the film to which Lucas's friends reacted so badly was in fact edited by Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, and Paul Hirsch. And by February of '77, Marcia Lucas and Richard Chew had already completed their work on Star Wars. Complicates things a bit, doesn't it?
This is even admitted by some of the greatest filmmakers of all time that these same know-nothing morons love to prize.
If you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong. You always think you're not going to get physically ill, but you do.
Enough said.
Back to this moronic idea that Marcia Lucas supposedly saved Star Wars in the edit, which despite her contributions to the films is also wildly inaccurate and has been debunked to oblivion at this point. Just like the bad faith interpretation of the whole rough cut reaction to the Star Wars films that Marcia Lucas was not involved with, despite each and every single one of the Star Wars films she was involved with having similarly disastrous rough cut screenings as well, but that's just weak sauce regardless. And even more weak sauce that these same clowns love to cling to is the fact that Marcia Lucas was the one who was awarded the Academy Award for her editing, and George Lucas didn't win an Academy Award for directing and screenwriting. But of course, they failed to mention the other 2 editors that also won Academy Awards, as well as the fact that they only won Academy Awards working under George Lucas and no one else. And despite decades of Marcia Lucas's complicity through silence, glamorizing her role through revisionism to give her credit that she doesn't deserve in order to discredit her ex-husband, at least Marcia also had the grace to say this.
George didn't win director. Well, that made me sad. If ever there was somebody who deserved a directing award, it was George Lucas for Star Wars.
My point that I'm getting at with all this is that Marcia was a very good editor, and George certainly appreciated that, probably more than anyone else. However, as we can see, George was also a good editor, as well as an excellent writer, director, and producer, and he was able to attain the support he needed to make Star Wars by proving his talent in all of those areas of filmmaking.
That being said, this is just one of many things wrong with using the Academy Awards as the sole metric for judgment on anything, in much the same way that solely relying on the Rotten Tomatoes score as an accurate judgment of a film's quality is stupid, because both of these are fallacious metrics, especially for the narrative that these assholes like to push. But you know what? We can play that game if you like. Because another thing they also fail to mention is that one of the big reasons why George Lucas never won an Academy Award is because he isn't a fan of Hollywood in general, and when push came to shove and George Lucas was chastised by Hollywood for releasing The Empire Strikes Back in the manner that he did, not adhering to the status quo, George Lucas once again trailblazing for many other filmmakers by telling Hollywood to stick their practices up their ass and insisting that the film credits should come after the movie and not before, so you can thank George Lucas for that too. But after which, George Lucas basically told Hollywood to fuck off and left the Directors and Writers Guild in the dust.
But in the wake of Empire, the filmmaker found himself unexpectedly mired in Hollywood politics. Lucas wanted the screen credits to come at the end of the movies. It was a highly unusual choice. And for the first Star Wars, the Writers Guild and Directors Guild had allowed it. But when Lucas did the same for the sequel, they fined him over $250,000 and even attempted to pull Empire from theaters. Next, the DGA went after Irvin Kershner. To protect his director, Lucas paid all the fines to the guilds, but the situation left him feeling frustrated and persecuted.
Lucas was so upset that he dropped out of the Directors Guild, the Writers Guild, and the Motion Picture Association.
So it should be no wonder why, after the original Star Wars, the movies accrued less and less nominations. Using the Academy Awards as a metric also means that George Lucas was nominated for Best Director multiple times for American Graffiti and A New Hope, and the quote-unquote actor's director, Irvin Kershner, wasn't even nominated for Best Director by the Academy for the quote-unquote bestest Star Wars movie ever made. And hell, the Academy Awards is possibly the biggest hole in this scumbag collective's anti-Lucas dialogue narrative, which these media outlets and countless online social influencer pseudo-critical clowns like to push. And it's also something that they definitely avoid bringing up at all costs, is that George Lucas, the guy who apparently can't write dialogue, was nominated by the Academy for Best Screenplay Writer, not only once for Star Wars A New Hope, but twice with American Graffiti as well.
George and Marcia again edited the early cuts of Graffiti together, again with George having final say. According to Jones, he edited the final cut by himself. Upon release, it became a critical darling, had very positive word of mouth among audiences, and was a bona fide smash at the box office. And something else that's worth bringing up about American Graffiti's success is that it netted the notorious hack fraud writer George Lucas the first of his 2 Oscar nominations for Best Screenplay. It turns out that the critics and the Academy were delighted by the dialogue of George Can't Write Dialogue Lucas. His second nomination came with Star Wars, you know, the movie with the terrible script that Marcia single-handedly saved in the editing room. I'm not saying this because I see any true merit in the Academy Awards, or really any awards show for that matter, but I've seen enough people mock George by pointing out that his wife won an Oscar for Star Wars and he didn't, so I just like to counter that by pointing out that George got 2 nominations specifically for his talents as a writer.
Yeah, Marcia won an Academy Award for doing what she was told by Lucas.
Do what you're told, bitch! Do what you're told, bitch!
And George Lucas may not have won an Academy Award, which to him would have likely been the equivalent of winning a load of fresh stool from his dog Indiana anyway. Hell, to him it probably would have meant less than that. But George Lucas was given more nominations by the Academy, for more categories even, than his ex-cougar-cheating, gold-digging wife anyway. And the Academy, whoever the fuck they are, the very experts these clowns love to put on a pedestal, thought George Lucas was an excellent dialogue writer from practically the very beginning of his feature-length filmmaking career. Look, the bottom line is this. All of George Lucas's collaborators deserve credit for what they actually did on the films, no more and no less. They were chosen with great care by Lucas for their artistic skill, aside from Gary Kurtz, who Lucas just took pity on, really. And they all contributed something that George actually liked, which they of course should be recognized for if you care to. But that should go without saying. These people did good work, but they are what they are and always have been. The Help. And I know I haven't had the kindest words to say about them, but my beef isn't with the contributions they made to Star Wars, which they should absolutely be praised for. It's with their dishonesty and revisionism, self-glamorizing themselves for the history books, as well as their complicity through silence in aiding this sycophantic culture, overstating their achievements and placing them on this pedestal which they seemed to relish, at the expense of the actual true genius and visionary behind Star Wars, who is the only reason they were allowed to fucking shine in the first place, and that person's name is George Lucas. However, if you want to be like this collective of fucking useless degenerates and start cooking up or regurgitating these ridiculous narratives about these collaborators being the secret source that quote-unquote saved George Lucas's movies from him,
get out of the cabin. I mean, I'd kill myself. The Help?
Well, first off, get a fucking clue, starting by reading Rinzler's books.
It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal.
And secondly, if you want to start championing The Help as the true arbiters behind the success of Star Wars, then you'll need to recognize the collaborative brilliance that allowed Nolan, Scorsese, Tarantino, Cameron, Scott, Zemeckis, and Spielberg to realize their films in the highest quality possible. That said, comparatively speaking anyway, nobody gives a shit about them because according to this sycophantic collective of George Lucas's unfinished childhood trilogy, none of those filmmakers had to be saved from themselves because none of them supposedly ruined their childhood, according to these pathetic clowns and their bullshit. But you know what? We aren't done yet, and there's one final squirt of weak sauce jizzed out of the mouth of these degenerates, including the media, fans, and influencers alike, which has become almost like their delusional ace in the hole of sorts. An undeniable piece of quote-unquote evidence that supposedly proves that George Lucas is a terrible writer, and it's a quote from that Star Wars prequel interview with Empire magazine back in 1999, and it's a quote by George Lucas himself. And as per their playbook, they cherry-pick the lines out of context, where Lucas says, quote, "I'd be the first person to say I can't write dialogue," and quote, "I'm aware dialogue isn't my strength. I use it as a device. I don't particularly like dialogue, which is part of the problem." And of course, just like basically all of Lucas's quotes that his detractors love to twist and use against him, they never use the full excerpt of the interview where Lucas elaborates on just what the hell he was saying. Now, this interview took place in the aftermath of the release of The Phantom Menace back in 1999. So just for the record, before we get into it, that means that these dipshits couldn't even cite their bread and butter for the narrative, which we all know because it's so tired as shit at this point, that being the sand line from Attack of the Clones, as one of their not so many bad faith examples which they like to recycle for George Lucas supposedly being incapable of writing dialogue. Since they always cite the same 3 or 4 fucking tired ass lines they always do every single time, which is just further evidence for how shaky their narrative is. Not to mention, the original trilogy had existed for far longer than The Phantom Menace did at the time of this interview, meaning the supposed long-standing criticisms against George's dialogue writing capabilities were taking place long before the prequels were ever made. And as I've spent the majority of this video discussing, George has kept his style of dialogue and collaborative process for making these movies consistent over the course of his whole career. So these people taking Lucas's quote in the extremely bad faith they've demonstrated, if you want to call it an argument, it's a self-defeating one because it's far more applicable to his earlier films, which again they love to cling to as untouchable masterpieces before everything changed and supposedly went wrong when his later films were released. Not only that, but using a citation of George simply selling himself short as someone who can't write, and as someone who doesn't enjoy writing, as somehow proof that he himself can't write, is weak-ass fucking sauce, when there's a mountain of evidence within his own movies that not only contradicts that...
I miss her.
Afraid to lose her, I think,
What does that got to do with anything?
Everything. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Is she free too?
I tried to free your mother, Annie, but Water wouldn't have it.
You're coming with us, aren't you, Mom?
Son, my place is here. My future is here. It is time for you to let go.
I don't want things to change.
But you can't stop the change, any more than you can stop the suns from setting. Oh, I love you.
I don't know.
Sure you do, you just don't want to tell me.
You gonna use one of your Jedi mind tricks on me?
They only work on the weak-minded.
Why do I get the feeling you're going to be the death of me?
Don't say that, Master. You're the closest thing I have to a father.
Then why don't you listen to me?
I am trying.
You spent as much time practicing your saber techniques as you did your witch who would rival Master Yoda as a swordsman.
I thought I already did.
Only in your mind, my very young apprentice.
You want to buy some death sticks?
You don't want to sell me death sticks.
I don't want to sell you death sticks.
You want to go home and rethink your life.
I want to go home and rethink my life.
Whatever happened?
I went into public service. You went on to become an artist.
Maybe he was the smart one.
You really don't like politicians, do you?
I was beginning to wonder if you'd got my message.
I retransmitted it just as you had requested, Master. Then we decided to come and rescue you.
Good job.
Well, then they should be made to.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Of course not me.
But someone.
Someone wise.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Just relax. Concentrate.
What about Padme? She seems to be on top of things.
Qui-Gon Jinn would never join you.
Don't be so sure, my young Jedi. You forget that he was once my apprentice, just as you were once his.
I have to admit that without the clones, it would not have been a victory.
Victory, Master Obi-Wan. Not victory. The shroud of the dark side has fallen. Begun. The Clone War has.
Remember back to your early teachings. All who gain power are afraid to lose it, even the Jedi.
The Jedi use their power for good.
Good is a point of view, Anakin.
I should have known the Jedi were plotting to take over.
Anakin, Chancellor Palpatine is evil!
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil.
Well, then you are lost!
I've been looking forward to this.
My powers have doubled since the last time we met, Count.
Good. Twice the pride, double the fall.
The Sith and the Jedi are similar in almost every way, including their quest for greater power.
The Sith rely on their passion for their strength. They think inwards, only about themselves.
And the Jedi don't.
The Jedi are selfless. They only care about others.
You're under arrest, Chancellor.
Are you threatening me, Master Jedi?
The Senate will decide your fate.
I am the Senate.
Not yet.
It's treason, then.
Do you like your army?
I look forward to seeing them in action.
They'll do their job well. I'll guarantee that.
Thank you for your time, Django.
Always a pleasure to meet a Jedi.
At last, the Jedi are no more.
Not if anything to say about it. I have.
Master Windu, how pleasant of you to join us.
This party's over.
Brave, but foolish, my old Jedi friend. You're impossibly outnumbered.
I don't think so.
We'll see.
At an end your rule is, and not short enough it was.
I sense Count Dooku.
I sense a trap.
Next move, spring the trap.
If so powerful you are, why leave?
You will not stop me. Darth Vader will become more powerful than either of us.
She's rich.
Rich?
Rich, powerful. Listen, if you were to rescue her, the reward would be...
What?
Well, more wealth than you can imagine.
I call it luck.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
Look, good against remotes is one thing. Good against the living, it's something else.
No. I am your father.
But taken at face value, citing someone's own self-assessment of their abilities as proof of their actual abilities is complete nonsense. One does not necessarily correlate with the other. Going by that logic, we'd have to take at face value any idiot who says, quote, I can write and direct a better Star Wars movie than George Lucas can. Or, I could totally have scored that goal and won the penalty shootout at the World Cup. And my personal favorite, I could totally beat that UFC fighter in a cage fight.
Fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
That's a good one.
An individual's self-assessment of their own abilities is irrelevant. What matters is what they manage to achieve when they put those abilities into practice. Which again, even if you want to indulge Lucas's quote at face value, is one of the most delicious ironies about the success of Star Wars. And not to mention, saying Lucas isn't the best at writing dialogue as a means of discrediting him is also weak sauce on the grounds that he's never been particularly fond of dialogue in the first place. And he's certainly not the only one, but I'll come back to that shortly. Anyway, here's how the interview actually went. The journalist questions Lucas, saying, the other stick everyone likes to beat you with is that you can't write dialogue. Lucas's quote, I'd be the first to say I can't write dialogue. My dialogue is very utilitarian and is designed to move things forward. I'm not Shakespeare, it's not designed to be poetic. It's not designed to have a clever turn of phrase. Okay, so right there, Lucas is just reaffirming what we already know and what we've already discussed about how he likes to use dialogue that doesn't overindulge itself. He makes a conscious effort to use as minimal dialogue as possible in a very less is more style that allows for the story to progress from start to finish. Lucas goes on. On the very first film, I had Bill and Gloria Huck, two of the screenwriters on American Graffiti, go through and do a dialogue polish on it. And that ultimately came out to be maybe a dozen lines where they added a snappy retort. After a while of working in the medium, I decided that wasn't ultimately essential to making the movies. So in the last few movies, we did not try and be clever with the dialogue. I just wanted to get from point A to point B. On the last few movies, meaning Lucas is referring to the original Star Wars trilogy. After he had his friends do a dialogue polish on American Graffiti, the same friends which helped him do a dialogue polish for the shooting script in A New Hope, Lucas realized he didn't particularly care for the snappy retort style of dialogue. The snappy retort, again, could be considered as part of the status quo at the time, and hell, let's be honest, it still is. So Lucas is also saying he didn't care for that conventional style, which was commonly used, and remember, he's saying this in regards to the original trilogy and not the prequels. Lucas, however, says the following in regards to The Phantom Menace. The film doesn't lend itself to that sort of thing because it's not about snappy one-liners. I think that lethal weapon style dialogue is overused. It's a necessary aspect of high action films where you have to have the smart retort. You have to say, quote, "I'll be back, baby," and stuff. It's not my style. It takes away from the integrity of the movie. In the first film, the characters were of that nature, especially Han Solo. I have to tell you, when Anakin gets older, he's going to be more in that mode, and there will be a lot more of that thing going on. But in this one, there's not. It's not a formula. There was no place for that kind of thing in this particular movie. I'm aware that dialogue isn't my strength. I use it as a device. I don't particularly like dialogue, which is part of the problem. Right, so remember when I said some refer to the style of dialogue used in the 80s action renaissance as the quote-unquote lethal weapon style of dialogue? As a matter of fact, some have even taken to calling it the lethal weapon style of dialogue.
See, I did say that.
Well, that was in fact George Lucas himself.
I know, right?
Setups and payoffs, ladies and gentlemen. And this is yet another counterpoint to the notion of Lucas supposedly not understanding or not being able to write dialogue. It just proves what I've said many times regarding the style of dialogue that's used in Star Wars. Lucas is perfectly aware of what was considered the status quo at the time when he did this interview. Action dialogue that largely consists of cheesy, snappy retorts and one-liners. If Lucas wanted to write a James Bond film, or wanted to write The Dark Knight, or wanted to write Spider-Man, or wanted to write Braveheart, or wanted to write Goodfellas, or The Godfather, or Terminator, or Die Hard, then George Lucas would have just done that. But that's not what Star Wars is, or what it was ever trying to be. It's not that he couldn't have done this, or that he didn't know how to do it. He simply opted for something else. Quote, "It's not his style." And although George Lucas has already cited this having been the case for his earlier films of the Star Wars saga, in this particular instance, he's referring to The Phantom Menace, where he talks about making a conscious effort to write dialogue that was appropriate for the characters and the story first and foremost in mind. He didn't just write dialogue that would simply cater to the marketplace, and as dialogue should be written, it was done on a case-by-case basis. And he wouldn't contrive dialogue that wouldn't suit the story, characters, genre, the setting, and the tone of the film. Ergo, he wouldn't write 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker in the same way he would write 30-year-old Han Solo. But George has made this no secret that he wasn't a fan of writing dialogue. And hell, he wasn't even a fan of making typical Hollywood-style movies in general.
My experiences in San Francisco, where there was a very large experimental film community called Canyon Cinema and Environs, and that's what I liked. I liked pure cinema, and when I went to school, that's what I was going to do. I said, I don't want to tell stories, I don't like to write scripts, I don't like characters, I don't like any of this stuff. Francis found out about it, and he said, I heard you're going to transfer to the animation department. What's that all about? And I said, well, I think you're boring. I said, I've done this. I don't want to do Hollywood movies. I have no interest in this at all. You know, I'm really going to go off and be a documentary cameraman. I'm going to do more experimental type of films. I do not like character-driven drama. I don't like plots. I'm not into this stuff.
But the point I'm going to be hammering away at is the delicious irony that although it was never his original intention, George Lucas became tremendously successful and good at making a Hollywood-style movie, including but not limited to the writing aspect of it.
When I started film school, I was a dyed-in-the-wool cinematic purist. I said, and I went to school, and they, I had to go into screenwriting, and I got into huge fights in the middle of classes with the screenwriting professor, saying, character is bullshit. Story doesn't mean anything. That's for the theater. That's for books. That's not for cinema. Cinema is the art of the moving image. You are eviscerating this whole art form with your kind of reproducing other mediums and other art forms. So I was really not a real fan of writing, which is ironic that mostly what I do now is write.
And just as a payoff to another setup, I think it's the perfect time to go through that excerpt from Runzler's book on the making of Empire Strikes Back that I've deliberately reserved for this section of the video, that outlines in great detail how the second draft for what many praise as the quote-unquote greatest Star Wars movie ever made actually came to be. And most importantly, why it came to be. And it sure as hell isn't because of the completely idiotic notion of George Lucas supposedly being removed from the equation that many of the most insufferable and parasitic ESB simps seem to cling to for this pathetic narrative of theirs. And Empire Strikes Back is in fact a perfect example of the incredibly weak source citation of George's dislike for writing scripts and his own self-assessment of his dialogue writing capabilities not correlating to his own actual talent for writing stories and screenplays. It reads as follows. With Brackett hospitalized, everyone waiting to get started, a locked-in production schedule, and no other writer on hand, Lucas was left with no choice but to write the second draft himself. The book then quotes Irvin Kershner. George doesn't like to write, Kershner says. Quote, he hates writing. End quote. The same, of course, has been true for each of Lucas's films so far, but he'd had to write every script except Raiders. It then quotes Lucas, I had no script and I didn't have anyone to write the damn thing, Lucas says. Quote, no matter how much I wanted to get out of writing, I was forced to sit down and work on it. It then quotes Joe Johnston. George would come in and say, hey, we're going to have this giant snow battle, start doing some storyboards. Says Johnston. Quote, but there was no script. But George would say, don't worry about that, just do the storyboards. The process was then to lay out random shots and pick some that would conceivably work. George would work on the script at home while I would be working on the boards. During meetings, he would pick out the shots that he felt looked promising and write them in. It was a very unusual evolution. Skipping past some irrelevant topics that pertain to one of the production crew members dividing their time between Empire Strikes Back and Alien, as well as Gary Kurtz coming to realize just how big of a task it will be to get Yoda to work, since the first draft script still included the earliest concepts of the character, the excerpt goes on. Lee Brackett died at Lancaster Community Hospital on Saturday, March 18th, at the age of 60. A press release went out on March 22 saying that the cause of death was a long bout with cancer. Her ashes would be sent to Kinsman, Ohio, to be buried next to her husband, Edmund Hamilton, who had also been a noted science fiction writer. A contract would be drawn up on August 25th, 1978, between Lucasfilm and the estate of Lee Brackett to confirm her contribution and remuneration beyond the original agreement. In other words, despite the fact that virtually none of Lee Brackett's work made it into the finished version of Empire Strikes Back, Lucas wasn't just gracious enough to keep her as co-screenplay credit, but also forked out much more money than he had to support her family after her passing. But hey, Alec Guinness can certainly attest as to how generous George Lucas is, despite the fact that many of these same scumbags who like to condemn him somehow have the nerve to ride the narrative that he only made his newer films as hollow, empty cash grab installments that ruined their childhood.
George Lucas raped our childhood, George Lucas.
But back on topic, continuing to work in his San Anselmo home, Lucas very quickly hammered out a second draft, finishing on April 1st, 1978. Incredibly fast when that 6 weeks is compared with the 3 years he'd spent writing his first Star Wars scripts. Which, as I said, Lucas had the far more arduous task in getting the first Star Wars made, because he had to basically make the damn thing from the ground up out of practically nothing, especially when it came to writing the script, where despite the problems on Empire Strikes Back's development, Episode 5 possessed many luxuries that the first Star Wars did not. As Lucas makes clear in this quote here, "I found it much easier than I'd expected. Almost enjoyable," he says. "It was easier because it's really part of the Star Wars story. I wrote it from my point of view, like I was going into that world. The risk I took was putting the action and adventure up front and then switching to a more personal film where people were going to be philosophical and worrying about emotional issues." The excerpt then reads, "In his script, the final film has taken a definitive form and the scenes are numbered, denoting Lucas's nearness to a shooting script." And granted, while there was still work to be done on the screenplay for Empire Strikes Back, particularly a major dialogue polish, which Lawrence Kasdan outlines in the story conference as Lucas's second draft never intending to be the finished script, as Rinzler's excerpt outlines, the final film of Empire with Lucas's draft took its definitive form. And it was written by a guy who not only created the series, but who modestly refers to himself as someone who can't write, and doesn't enjoy the practice of writing, which many of his detractors that love to cling to Empire as the best for all the wrong reasons, love to cite as the very reason why. That should tell you how Lucas's modesty about his own abilities does not reflect his talent whatsoever. In addition to the fact that, again, he managed to write this draft in 6 weeks, despite not enjoying the practice of writing. And despite doing all the heavy lifting when it came to the writing, he had the modesty to not even attach his own name to the screenplay credit, which is the only reason these disingenuous dumb fucks can even push this pathetic, fucking, wildly inaccurate narrative against him as supposedly having almost nothing to do with what they consider as the greatest Star Wars movie ever made.
Really makes you think.
And for those inept, empty-headed dumb fucks out there who like to use painter analogies, most infamously, the whole Star Wars Special Edition changes is just like if Da Vinci edited the Mona Lisa bullshit. Like, setting aside the fact that painters constantly make edits to their work, and the Mona Lisa had been altered numerous times by Da Vinci himself, but of course, freaks from the Gen X versus George Lucas cuckumentary have absolutely no frame of reference or insight. These are the same individuals who like to take George's modesty in bad faith and use it as ammunition against him. George not much liking having to write dialogue, and not thinking much of his own skill as a writer, does not make him a bad writer. Those are two completely different things. An almost perfect example for comparison, and a glaring contradiction for this notion, is one of the most famous and well-regarded artists of all time. I'm talking about Michelangelo. You ever been to the Sistine Chapel? Well, I have, soft flex. It's absolutely magnificent. It was painted by Michelangelo, and he absolutely despised every single second of it, even going as far to write poetry about how miserable he was. But Michelangelo wasn't primarily a painter. He did paint, but he much preferred sculpting. He loved sculpting much more than painting, just like George Lucas much prefers editing and visual filmmaking to the typical directing and screenwriting process when making his own art. And that's not to compare Star Wars to the Sistine Chapel in terms of quality. That is very much apples and oranges, but they are both well-renowned pieces of art that have stood the test of time. So has The Phantom Menace, for that matter, as recently shown, as well as the other 2 prequels, which are very much a part of that, the dialogue included. Again, George selling himself short doesn't quote-unquote prove anything about his screenwriting capabilities, and similarly to Michelangelo in principle, just because an artist is hyper-competent in one aspect of his work, or simply prefers one aspect of their work, it doesn't mean they are incompetent when it comes to other aspects of art, which they are not particularly fond of. The Sistine Chapel is living proof of that, as is the 6-part Star Wars saga. Simply put, George Lucas knows how to write dialogue and scripts, even if he doesn't like doing it. Like, for fuck's sake, not only did he go to film school, but he learned from Francis Ford Coppola how to write scripts, so he knows how to do it. It's just that George Lucas treats script writing and dialogue almost like a necessary evil in terms of telling a story. And as it turns out, much of George Lucas's outlook on writing dialogue, or even including dialogue, is a sentiment shared by much more than just him. Now, for those of you who may have been somewhat butthurt that I had the unmitigated goal to bring up the legendary Michelangelo for this topic, an artist who much preferred one aspect of the craft despite being hyper-competent in other areas as well, in order to make this point about an artist's self-admitted weakness or dislike for aspects of the craft not being a direct reflection of their talent, how about we opt for someone who has been regarded by many as one of the greatest modern filmmaking minds in recent years? In 2024, the director of the critically acclaimed and audience-praised live-action adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune series, Denis Villeneuve, apologies if I mispronounced that, he himself discussed how he wasn't particularly a fan of writing dialogue either, and that he thinks film is meant to be much more of a visual experience, which if taken at face value is actually incredibly similar in philosophy to George Lucas. And if you've seen some of Villeneuve's films, bearing in mind his comments about dialogue, it's really incredibly obvious that he doesn't like to place all that much emphasis on it. But I've scarcely heard anyone, if at all, say Denis Villeneuve is a bad screenplay writer. So are these same individuals going to all of a sudden flip-flop and start spinning a narrative about how Denis Villeneuve can't write scripts and that he needs more talented people, quote-unquote, to bring his ideas to fruition? Yeah, I thought not. It's also worth pointing out, just as the last nail of this farcical attempt to discredit Lucas based on his own assessment of himself, but condemning Lucas's work as not having the strongest, most well-written dialogue in cinema history is hardly anything Lucas or any of his colleagues who strive for the same goals would take offense to. Lucas in the interview humbly outlines dialogue as not being his strength.
So what?
And I'm certain that's largely because he's never sought out to make movies that are carried on the basis of exquisitely written heavy dialogue.
I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker, so the movie rests in the visuals.
Lucas has always strived to be a strong visual filmmaker first and foremost. So even though it's an incorrect assessment to say his dialogue is terrible,
I call it luck. In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
Again, based on the ridiculous notion of this isn't how real people talk, based on 3, maybe 4 cherry-picked examples divorced from their original context and examined in very bad faith, you know, as it always is, but criticizing Lucas by citing the dialogue aspect of Star Wars while still playing an important role as not being its strongest aspect or even being its weakest is like, for instance, citing a horror movie's weakest aspect being its lack of humor. Or hell, even more accurately, citing the side dish or salad as not being the strongest and or the weakest aspect of a full-course steak dinner at a Michelin star steakhouse. It's like, yeah, you can, but that was never really the point, now was it? Because that's basically what the dialogue in Star Wars has always been. It's a side dish. It's more of a necessary evil to tell the story and connect the dots for the audience and give the film that extra bit of flavor, as opposed to, say, The Godfather and A Few Good Men, which we discussed earlier, that are almost completely reliant on the dialogue aspect to tell their story. Just because some filmmakers, writers, or any multidisciplined artist who's known in being hyper-competent in one aspect of their work, it doesn't mean they can't be extremely well-rounded in other aspects of art as well. Again, going back to Michelangelo, if that were the case, we sure as shit wouldn't have the Sistine Chapel. And that's only one example. And you don't find success the way that George Lucas did without being a well-rounded filmmaker. And it's proven by the fact that in the Star Wars saga alone, he wrote 6 very successful scripts. If Lucas considers his dialogue writing the weakest aspect of his films, again, much like Alec Guinness's assessment of Star Wars as quote-unquote fairy tale rubbish that consisted of quote-unquote rubbish dialogue, again, even though that's largely cited as being based on one of Lucas's earlier drafts, once again, it really isn't saying much. Now is it? And side note, the first time I'd seen this interview cited as supposed proof of Lucas's inability to write dialogue, not only was the quote taken out of context, of course, but it just so happened to be in the comments section of a YouTube short of this commonly cherry-picked Mark Hamill interview that's constantly used to propagate that lie about George's supposed terrible dialogue writing for the original Star Wars film that we've so meticulously torn to shreds at this point. No surprise there, I'm sure. Perhaps above all else, the fact that George can so humbly criticize himself in this interview not only proves that he can take criticism, even though the majority of that criticism comes from a cavalcade of morons who are far less qualified, if at all, to provide said criticism.
What I've done over the years, and when I started out like everybody else, I sort of read the critics, and after a while, and you read not only the criticism of your movies, but everyone else's movies. But and as you start to make movies, you obviously meet the critics, over time, I began to realize that the level of criticism, at least in cinema, in the last part of this century in the United States, was pretty low. It was you sort of begin to realize that the institution itself is not what it's supposed to be, and I realized that I didn't need to take that seriously. There are a few critics overseas, and occasionally a critic will come along or an article will be written that is a very astute analysis of the movie. And there's value in that. There's value in reading material or listening to critics that have actually something intelligent to say. But we live in a world now of sound bites and literary commerce in terms of the journalistic community, selling newspapers, selling books. And they do that simply by trashing things. They don't criticize them or they don't analyze them. They simply trash them for the sake of a headline or something that they can use to shock people to get them to buy whatever it is they're selling. And you have to learn not to take that seriously. And the older you get, the less serious you take it. And, I've gotten to a point now where I ignore it completely. It's just not relevant to me anymore.
How worried are you that the critics are not going to like this new movie?
Oh, I'm not worried at all. They haven't liked any of them, really. And they especially haven't liked the last two. So,
well, exactly.
Hey, it can't get any worse.
Yeah, but come on. When they go after your writing, your directing, it has to hurt.
Oh, it always hurts.
It has to hurt.
It hurts a great deal. But part of making movies is you get attacked, and sometimes in very personal ways.
Did you not say ever to yourself, well, maybe they had a point with this or with that?
The point is, it's like if you paint your house white and somebody comes along, well, that should be a greenhouse. Well, fine, but I wanted to paint it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with painting it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with me for painting it white. Maybe it should be a greenhouse. But I didn't want it to be a greenhouse. I wanted it to be a White House.
But why the fuck would George Lucas listen to any of these pseudo-intellectual critics or journalists?
I've come across people that have no imaginations at all, and it's a very interesting...
They become journalists.
As opposed to his most ardent critics, which just so happen to be George Lucas's closest friends and colleagues.
They're men with jobs, Jerry!
That also happen to be some of the greatest filmmaking minds of all time.
So, I think you have to have a thick enough skin to cope with the criticism. I'm very self-critical, and I have a lot of friends that I trust and who are film directors and writers and people in my profession. I trust them to be extremely critical. But I trust their opinion, and their opinion is thoughtful, knowledgeable. And I also know them personally, so I know the psychological slant they're putting on it. I know what their tastes are. And I can say, well, that's great for them, but that's not great for me. Because most criticism, when it comes to movies, there's technical criticism, which is extremely helpful, but you're only going to really get that from your peers. I've discovered that most critics themselves are cinematically illiterate. They don't really know much about movies. They don't know the history. They don't know the technology. They don't know anything. So for them to try to analyze it, they're lost. But your friends usually know what they're doing, and they can critique the technical side of things to say this doesn't work. You're putting the cart before the horse, this kind of stuff. And then the rest of it is what you like. It's a personal, it's in the eye of the beholder. I like this movie. I don't like this movie. There's a lot of movies that are badly made that I love. There's a lot of movies that are just beautifully made, but I don't like them. And critics have a tendency that's all they focus on, which is I like it, I don't like it. It's good, it's bad. And it doesn't work that way.
These friends of his, which he would host private screenings for each of the rough cuts of his films for, and would edit his movies based on that feedback for the release version that was ready to be shown in theaters, and yes, including the prequels, as I will demonstrate later on. But above all else, this interview also demonstrates that George Lucas is his own harshest critic. And that's because, if you know anything about the man and how he treats his success, he's quite possibly one of the most modest filmmakers of all time. Having achieved more than anyone could have ever dreamed of, he still doesn't put those accolades up on any kind of pedestal.
If there's one thing that you would like to be remembered for, one project that you have done or that you have yet to do, what would it be?
Raising my kids.
There you go. That's a human being right there, folks.
It's a lot harder than making movies, let me tell you.
Not to mention, despite it all coming together in the end, Lucas had little to no faith that Star Wars would be well received. And all of his friends, who were far more qualified to render any kind of critique against him than these online internet clowns, were all in the rough cut screenings and also thought the film would bomb. The only one who knew Star Wars would succeed from the beginning was Steven Spielberg.
I want to ask one last thing, which is, at what point then, when you edited the film, at what point, what screening was it where you finally realized this was going to work, this was going to be something special?
I never realized it.
Really?
No. I finished it, and I was completely exhausted. 3 years of my life, blood, and everything was going wrong all the time, and everything was sort of half of what I was hoping it would be. It's like when you finish the day and you said, shit, that didn't go well. And then you cut it together and you say, well, maybe we can save it by doing this, and maybe we can do it. So it was all like that. And I showed it, an early version, which still had all of the World War II footage in it and everything, which I showed to a bunch of my friends, which I'd done on all my movies. I invited it to come and see it. I mean, just, a little screening at the house. And, there was like 12 of them, and some of them were very vocal, like, oh my God, what have you done? Some of them were, by their personalities and the kind of movies, they're all directors and writers. So, some of them that are a little hard were saying, what's all this force shit? You can't make a movie like that. For God's sake, this is ridiculous. But he helped me. I had a roll-up at the head that was about twice as long as it was. He said, you're never going to make that. Let me help you write a new roll-up here. Right. So even though he was, he makes horror movies. So he
being Brian De Palma.
Brian De Palma.
Right.
And if you don't
got
cut
to name names.
If you don't cut somebody open and have blood splattering everywhere, he just thinks it's a wussy film. But he's a good friend, and he really wanted it to work. The only one that believed in it was Steve Spielberg. He's the only one.
Know, right?
He's the one that said, this is going to be the biggest film in the history of movies. And everybody looked at him like, are you out of your mind? He said, no, I believe it. I'm telling you. And they all thought he was completely nuts. And I did too, actually. So I didn't believe anything he said. Laddie called me and said, it's a hit. It's a hit. He called me about 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. He said, it's a hit. My God, we sold out in every theater. This is fantastic. I said, Laddie, you guys have done Planet of the Apes. You know that science fiction movies always do well in the first weekend because they're all the fans and everything. They'll do it well. It's not a hit until the fourth week. You call me in the fourth week and tell me it's working.
Excellent, and I'm sure he did. And we're going to have to leave it there.
Hell, even after the edited final cut was put together, George still didn't think Star Wars would succeed, in part due to budget constraints preventing him from achieving what he wanted to, but literally everyone else thought the film was going to be a worldwide phenomenon. So for those people using this whole, even George Lucas, quote, doesn't think dialogue is his strength, unquote, as even George Lucas admits he's a shitty writer, is A, an incredibly disingenuous perception of the quote, and B, George Lucas's modesty clearly does not reflect his ability. George still learnt to write screenplays from Francis Coppola. He still put the work in and wrote 6 of the most influential screenplays of all time, and he did it in a style all his own, which in of itself is an incredible achievement, especially for someone who doesn't like writing screenplays. But the point of all this is that the extremely bad faith criticisms of Lucas's dialogue tend to use this as the Achilles heel for their argument, when in actuality it's just another example of George Lucas being an incredibly modest individual. But of course, their narrative is so flimsy that they need to take Lucas's quotes out of context in extremely bad faith in order to attach their own meanings to his words that suit their agenda, and they need to misuse quotes from his cast and crew or deliberately lie about them to manipulate the gullible, vocal minority of internet sheep into aligning with their petulant point of view about how Lucas ruined their childhood. And just like any false narrative, in order for them to make it work, they have to cling to whatever they can, even if it means scraping the bottom of the barrel in order to make it work. Including, but not limited to, showcasing out-of-context clips of the Star Wars cast and crew simply recounting events or funny moments from their individual experiences from filming the movies, or hell, just snipping clips or quotes out of context that simply showcase George Lucas being a humble person.
Firstly, what's been your favourite Star Wars parody? I love your parody so much.
Well, there's a one that was done a long time ago called Hardware Wars, which has become infamous, and there's a new one that's just starting on the circuit now called George Lucas in Love.
George Lucas in Love?
Yes, which is very funny. It's you know, take off on Shakespeare in Love, only it's how I came up with Star Wars.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And you don't mind, it's not savage or anything?
No.
Okay,
It's
you said when George Lucas in Love, it was one of those sort of satirical porno films.
Yeah.
It's graceful.
I wish.
Yeah. So if you make that as a film, I want to cut. Okay.
So humble, in fact, that he isn't afraid to poke fun at himself publicly from time to time, and or let others poke fun at him, with humor that's done in good taste as well. Hence why he even allowed Seth MacFarlane to make the Family Guy parody series in the first place.
This was an absolute joy for everyone involved to be able to do this. Everyone on staff knows just about everything you've done, almost verbatim. Your company was supportive from the start. Why are you guys so much nicer than everyone else? Why did you allow us to do this?
Well, I think ultimately we don't have to be mean. You know, we're not really that competitive. I came out of film school with a lot of friends, and we all helped each other. We helped each other in our careers, and we just never were competitive about anything. We were always competitive in a friendly way to say, you know, like playing cards or, you know, dunking baskets to say, okay, you're so smart, try this, you know. And so it's that kind of competition, not the, you know, you must be destroyed and you must fail so I can win and all that sort of thing.
And it's for this very reason that these slimy internet pricks even have the means to twist these good-natured instances of humor and humility into disingenuous ammunition clips, pun very much intended, to discredit George Lucas for supposed gotchas and or criticisms that were levied against Lucas as quote-unquote evident by his own admission, and or because supposedly the original trilogy cast and crew were the only ones that were outspoken against him, unlike the dreaded prequel films that supposedly ruined everything and apparently didn't have one single solitary person with a spine on the entire set.
That's a good one.
When in actuality, in the case of his cast and crew on the original trilogy, as clearly evident by what we've discussed, they were simply recounting or embellishing some inside jokes from fond memories they had while filming on set. Because, and here's a newsflash, they're all friends. And George is very much in on the joke with them.
I said to George, you can type this stuff, but you can't say it. move your mouth while you're talking, while you're typing it, and I couldn't say it. It took me like 15 takes.
And I'd like to especially thank Francis, who, more than anyone else, started my career. He was my mentor, my nudge, and he never gave up on me. He took me from not being able to write a word to being the king of wooden dialogue.
Remember, they're just jokes.
The only ones that haven't caught on to this are his detractors that somehow, despite carrying themselves as the intellectual arbiters on the matter, are still unable to grasp this. When it comes to George Lucas and his style for Star Wars, the acting, directing, camera work, and the dialogue, each and every single one of his main cast on the original films conceded that Lucas knew what he was doing, and the bulk, if not all of the quote-unquote proof used to reinforce this idiotic sentiment to the contrary, be it old interviews with the cast members or excerpts from quotes out of context, often cited in secondhand sources such as YouTube videos and or journalist articles, I'd imagine this would come as a bit of a shock to those of you who have spent your entire lives buying into the anti-Lucas agenda. But the more you outline the facts, the more you have to accept that 99% of the internet's agenda against George Lucas is utter bullshit.
Complete bullshit.
It's all a fugazi. You know what a fugazi is?
Fake.
Yeah, fugazi. It's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust. It's not fucking real.
Cooked up by a bunch of petulant, butthurt pseudo-intellectuals that dropped out of film school, who thought they had all the answers, and when they didn't, they had to construct lies of their own. And they continued with this because they knew how easy it was to line their wallets with your gullibility.
No, I don't believe it. It's not possible.
I didn't say it would be easy, Nick. I just said it would be the truth.
Stop. Let me out! I want out!
And you might not want to accept it, but it's all evident by the actual quotes made by the cast and crew and what they actually meant, the timeline of events that took place throughout the making of the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as credible first and second-hand sources, including but not limited to J.W. Rinzler's documentary book series, as well as Paul Duncan's. This narrative, these petulant, parasitic pitifuls versus George Lucas love to indulge, is nothing but a coping mechanism, used to justify their own dislikes for his newer films and or artistic choices, whilst allowing them guilt-free to still cling to his older films, which according to their delusions, were all timeless works of art that were utterly without flaw before supposedly George Lucas sucked the magic out of their precious space fantasy franchise with the prequels. Even though every release after the original Star Wars that George Lucas made, including the prequels, were almost unanimously praised upon release, but still faced its own share of detractors and criticisms that cited the newest installment as supposedly paling in comparison to the one that came before.
It's funny, you know, people always say that now. They comment about, you know, Empire being a favorite. Yet at the time, it was not considered that. You have to think back, you know, how so capricious the world of entertainment is, you know, in terms of the audience response. You know, the first film came out, New Hope, and it was extremely well received, surprised everyone. It, you know, it had all the success of something brand new for the first time. Then you do a sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. And people's expectations now are very high. They remember how they reacted to the first film. And Empire is paced differently, and it's a darker story. And it doesn't have a complete resolution at the end. It leaves things undone. And when it came out, there was a lot of reaction of disappointment. There wasn't this judgment that it was the best of the three films or anything of that sort. It was a success, of course, and it was, you know, respected. But people spoke less of it. There was kind of, you know, well, it's okay, I guess. And, you know, it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. It was sort of the attitude. Given time, you look back at this middle act, which is The Empire Strikes Back, and it takes on it's in a different context. You know, you see the good performances. You're not bothered by the lack of resolution in the story completely. It's satisfying. You know that it's part of a greater story. And you're not just measuring against the impact the first film had. I think when they're all done and, 10 years go by, maybe they'll sort of put them all together and look at it. Maybe it'll take on some new meaning that we don't know about yet. I think it will.
But regarding this ridiculous and baseless notion of Star Wars supposedly losing the magic, particularly in the acting, directing, and dialogue department due to the absence of certain individuals on the original trilogy, which of course doesn't venture past a couple of regurgitated and deliberately misinterpreted lines. Look, the bottom line is this. The dialogue in Star Wars has always been kept to the same inspirations, style, and formula, and has remained consistent throughout all 6 of the Star Wars movies, as did the collaborative process which each of the films went through, and according to both J.W. Rinsler and Paul Duncan, who have done extensive research and interviews on this matter for each of their book series, this was absolutely the case with how George Lucas worked on the Star Wars prequels as well. And that is what the next part of this series will be dedicated to discussing. In part 3, The Magic Never Left, which will talk extensively about how George Lucas kept his style intact, not just in terms of his filmmaking process on the prequels, but his collaborative process as well. And it will also demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that the supposed Star Wars math people like to use, of less George Lucas supposedly equaling greater Star Wars, is completely nonsensical and utter bullshit.
Is there any truth to that?
That's complete bullshit.
Right.
I know I've already covered that in earnest, but much of what I've already discussed mainly pertains to the original trilogy, or again, to put it more snarky, the unfinished childhood trilogy that this certain collective of degenerates obsessively clings to. But part 3 will be heavily focused on the prequel trilogy, and as much as my channel is known for being heavily focused on the prequel trilogy, this video is actually the first time I've actually done any kind of deep dive on the original trilogy. And as tedious and painstaking as it was to put together, it was also an absolute blast and I loved every second. In all honesty, I don't like making videos that are just beating a dead horse or constantly just dealing with low-hanging fruit or the latest hot topic that comes around, like so many shameless influencer algorithm whores and journalists love to do with pop culture and discussing movies. I like to challenge myself, and this was a great challenge and a subject matter I really care about. In all honesty, it's hard to make videos when I don't care about the subject matter. I genuinely don't know how people on this platform can lower themselves to doing that. I find it detestable and, as I said, completely shameless. But that being said, if I have made an error or two throughout this video and the rest of the series, please know it was not done in bad faith. I'm just trying to give the most accurate video I can, which, compared to the rest of the internet at least, I can do so in my sleep. But alas, thank you for staying till the end of this video. The next part isn't as long as this one, so I don't imagine it will take me too long to follow up this video. Take care, all of you. See you next time. #OG Lucas.